Flirting with the Wrong Brother, written by Virna DePaul, narrated by Ellen Lang. Prologue. Dalton's Magic Rule Number 1. Never reveal your secrets. Hey, Ladybug. 14-year-old Melina Parker's hand jerked at the sound of Rhys Dalton's voice, causing the lizard in her palm to scamper away. Standing, she frowned to hide the sudden flight of butterflies in her stomach. Darn it, Rhys, it took me almost an hour to get that one to come to me. Even at 16, Rhys towered over Melina. He was an identical twin, and she could barely believe there were two gorgeous guys with that same shade of honey-colored hair and light green eyes walking the earth. Your mom said to tell you to stay clean. The left side of his mouth quirked up, revealing the slightest hint of a dimple. Guess it's too late for that. Melina glanced down at the dust covering her jeans. Grimacing, she slapped at the dirt and groaned. She's going to kill me. She's already mad that I wouldn't wear the dress she bought me. You should have seen it, Rhys. It had polka dots. I mean, me in polka dots. Can you imagine? Oh, come on, it makes sense. Plus, I think you'd be cute in a dress. At the quiet words, Melina's head jerked up. He couldn't have meant... No, of course not. He'd been so distant lately. He wasn't even looking at her. Instead, he was staring down at a playing card in his hand, folding it. Nothing strange about that. Like their parents, Rhys and his twin brother Max were always fiddling with some kind of magic trick. He was particularly fond of making coins disappear. Sometimes she wished he could make her crush on him disappear just as easily, but first she'd have to admit it to him. That was so never going to happen. She'd seen the types of girls he and Max were attracted to, and plain chubby tomboys need not apply. At least he didn't call her four-eyed Porker Parker the way some of the boys at school did. In fact, when Rhys had heard Scott Thompson called her that, he'd tracked Scott down and given him a warning. Now, whenever Melina got close, Scott couldn't get away from her fast enough. Nudging her glasses in place, she moved closer, trying to see what Rhys was doing. So have you heard from Max? His hands paused briefly before continuing. Just that he doesn't hate football camp nearly as much as he thought he would. Might have something to do with the girls' camp next door. She snickered. Bet you're wishing you'd gone to camp when you'd had the chance, huh? Nope. Why not? His gaze met hers. Unlike Max's, Rhys's pupils had a slight amber ring around. She'd read somewhere that differing eye color in identical twins was extremely rare. The subtle difference fit Rhys's personality. While Max was almost always carefree and playful, Rhys had a quiet calmness about him, as if part of his mind was someplace else, someplace no one else could go. He shrugged. Time at home is rare, you know that. Melina nodded. She did. It was the hardest thing about being friends with the Dalton twins, the amount of time she had to spend missing them. Unless Rhys's folks were working up a new act, like now, they'd spend their time traveling and performing. Still, despite having to be schooled on the road by tutors, Rhys and Max always seemed to enjoy going to new places. She certainly envied their chance to see more than this small university town she called home. Poor baby, she teased, plucking a blade of grass from the ground and twirling it. Getting to see the world with your famous parents must be a drag, huh? He frowned, then shook his head. No, you're right. It's great. He thrust his hand toward her. Here, to replace the one I scared away. Dropping the blade of grass, she reached out and took the card. Looking down at it, she gasped. He'd folded the card into a shape that clearly resembled a lizard with one spade as its eye. A smile split her face and she actually squealed, "It's so cute!" She looked up, happy to see that his frown had disappeared. A hank of hair had fallen over his eyes and her fingers itched to push it back. She wouldn't have thought twice about it if it had been Max, but with Rhys? She couldn't risk revealing how she felt about him. Next thing she knew, he'd pat her on the head and stop talking to her altogether, and that would kill her. He shoved his hands in his pockets and shrugged again. I got this book from the library. A movement behind his shoulder made her eyes widen. Max? She looked at Rhys, whose expression stiffened. It's Max! Running past Rhys, she threw herself at his brother, who laughed and lifted her, twirling her around before setting her on her feet. Even to an outsider, the differences between him and his brother would be obvious now. He was tanner, and his hair had grown longer, almost touching his shoulders. She reached out and flipped it. "What's with the girly hair?" He narrowed his eyes and flicked a finger over her nose. "Still playing in the dirt, are you?" She slapped his hand away. "You're home early. Rhys said you were having fun at camp." "I was, but I wanted to see what Mom and Dad were up to with the act. They're really pushing for something unique with the European tour. Your parents are helping them?" "Every day for the past week, some kind of mechanical thingy." Max grinned and flung an arm around her shoulder. "Cool, let's go check it out." "Okay, but first look what Rhys made me." She lifted up the paper lizard even as she turned to Rhys. "It's so cool. Rhys, let's—" Rhys walked past her, nodding at his brother and slapping him on the shoulder. "Come on, dude, you're gonna love it. It's huge, As they walked in front of her, the two of them laughing and shoving, Melina frowned. She watched them, the easy way they had with each other, and hesitated. They'd be back on the road in another few weeks, and then it would be just her and her parents in their quiet little house, all of their noses immersed in books. No one to call her ladybug or practice tricks on. No one to dream about. Which was silly, anyway. Her parents said things came to fruition through research and application, not dreaming. And they were right about everything. Except polka dot dresses, she amended. With a sigh, she carefully pocketed the paper lizard and scrambled to catch up with them. "Hey, guys, wait up!" Chapter 1. Dalton's Magic Rule Number 2. Continually challenge yourself. "Listen to this," Lucy Conrad said, waving Melina's magazine like a red flag. 98.9% of all women sometimes wish their lovers would just flirt with them. Tossing the magazine on the sofa, she pointed a finger in Melina's direction, her short and spiky red hair fairly vibrating. "You know what that means, don't you?" "That women like to feel wanted," Melina guessed, handing Lucy a pint of Ben & Jerry's Cherry Garcia ice cream before dropping into her chair across from her. Sitting cross-legged, Melina adjusted her glasses, then scooped out a bite of Chunky Monkey from her own carton. It had been exactly 7 days since she'd allowed herself this taste of heaven. When the cold confection touched her tongue, she closed her eyes in appreciation. She purred. "Gotta love girls' night in." "You can say that again." The soft but impassioned reply came from Grace Sinclair, who sat in a chair next to Melina. Melina held out her spoon and Grace delicately tapped it with her own. Grace, a career counselor in the university's humanities department, was class and calmness personified. While Lucy was Cherry Garcia, cherry ice cream with cherries and fudge flakes, Grace was Ben & Jerry's creme brulee, sweet custard ice cream with caramelized sugar swirl. Blonde and willowy with cool porcelain skin, Grace spoke with just a hint of a southern drawl. "All we need is a Viggo Mortensen movie and I'd be halfway to heaven." Melina giggled as Lucy thumped on the magazine she'd been reading from. "Seriously," Lucy insisted. "This does not mean women like to feel wanted. It means they settle for fantasies instead of focusing on what they really want at the beginning of a relationship. Which is exactly what you're doing, Melina." Sighing, Melina forced a smile. The last thing she wanted was to have another argument with Lucy about Professor Jamie Whitcomb. Unfortunately, despite the dusting of freckles that made Lucy look more like one of her students than a tenured professor, Lucy was a bulldog when it came to protecting her friends, even from themselves. "And exactly what should I be focusing on?" she asked. "Passion," Lucy fired back. Of course, passion, Lucy's favorite word. "And by passion you mean—" "The kind of passion you don't feel for Jamie." The kind of passion she'd never felt for any man, Melina thought. Any man except Rhys, that is. But thinking of Rhys only made her sad, and being sad while she ate Ben & Jerry's was just wrong. "Ah," Melina said softly, trying not to sound too bitter. "You mean the kind of mutual passion that leads to love and lifelong happiness and is about as real as unicorns or flying dragons." "Rarity isn't the same as fantasy," Lucy exclaimed. She stood, her face all flushed and her hands gesturing wildly. "That's what women have been taught nowadays, that passion and true love and friendship all rolled into one is impossible, so they settle." "Lucy does have a point," Grace admitted. Passion must be a basic female need. Otherwise, why would such a huge percentage of women be craving it? Women want passion, but if it's not in a man's true nature to give it to her, then what's the point in wishing for it? Compatibility, respect, even love, that's what matters. After Brian, I was sure I was through with men for good. But then Jamie approached me. He's smart and kind and funny. I think I could be happy with him. She heard the hesitation in her voice, but charged on. I just need a little extra insurance that I can make him happy too. I've never been good at flirting. As my mom always said, practice makes perfect, right? Lucy's brows furrowed while Melina gave an internal groan. She recognized the challenge behind that drawl. For a woman who was so contained, Grace could throw down a challenge like nobody's business. Worse yet, she'd be the first to take one up, which made Lucy and Melina hard-pressed to turn one down themselves. Melina turned to Grace, whose impish smile was unmistakable. "And just who are you suggesting I practice with?" she asked. In sync, all of their gazes moved to the same shelf of pictures. Melina's stomach clenched even as she zoomed in on the most recent edition. Max and Rhys both looked impossibly handsome in black tuxedos. She'd taken it at the IBM Magic Convention in Vegas last year, right after they'd beat out Chris Angel and Lance Burton for Best Stage Magician of the Year. Of course, in the picture, each had an arm around his date. Max, a tall, leggy redhead, and Rhys, a stacked brunette. Melina looked down at her ice cream container. Unless they had begun manufacturing implants, she'd bet that brunette had never heard of Ben & Jerry. Defiantly, she took a fortifying bite. "No way," she mumbled around the spoon. "Rhys doesn't even like me anymore. We haven't talked for months." Obviously, he was too preoccupied with the showgirl-type women he was often photographed with to have time for an old friend. Of course, he'd proved to her long ago that the hottest chick was more important than friendship. Her mistake had been in thinking it was a one-time thing. "Forget it, I'm not asking Rhys." Her tone brooked no argument, or so she thought. After a few seconds, Lucy shot her a sideways glance. "Okay, so if not Rhys, what about Max?" Melina choked, coughed, and wheezed. "Max?" "Of course," Grace said, nodding and smiling in delight. "She's completely comfortable with him." "Not that comfortable," Melina interjected, only to be ignored. "She trusts him," Lucy agreed. "He's a hottie. They've already kissed once. That was almost 12 years ago, and he felt sorry for me. And he's flying in on her birthday. He's perfect." "Perfect," Grace echoed. "And exactly what issue would you two be addressing?" She looked over at Grace, who'd started to braid a strip of her long, pale hair. "Grace?" Grace stopped braiding, bit her lip, then shrugged, her mouth twisting into a sardonic smile. "No point in denying my greatest fear, now is there? My birthday's 2 weeks away from yours, so I'll try to find the man I fear doesn't exist. I'm sure it will just lead to another weekend of frustration." Although she felt herself softening, Melina didn't reach out to her friend. This challenge had been Grace's idea. Maybe she needed it more than Melina did. She hadn't dated in almost a year. Lucy, on the other hand, often put up with a man's failings longer than she should. Melina turned to her friend, keeping her face impassive despite the scowl on Lucy's face. Lucy's birthday wasn't for a few months, but it was a big one, the big 3-0. "I should get a pass on this one," Lucy said. "I'm fearless, you know that. I've tried everything there is to try. There's no reason—" "You fear intimacy," Grace said gently. "You only date jerks, guys who are never gonna commit to you." "Just because I happen to love brooding, creative men with an edge does not mean I fear intimacy," Lucy protested. "It's one weekend, Lucy. One weekend with a nice guy you normally wouldn't give a second look," Melina clarified. "A nice guy?" Lucy looked outraged. She held up a hand to forestall Melina's response. "But fine, if you two can do it, then so can I." Lucy paused and smiled sweetly, which from her was the equivalent of a big flashing danger sign. "I call the stakes. Anyone who puts their plan in motion and sticks with it the entire birthday weekend, regardless of the results, gets a full day of pampering at Silk Spa. Anyone who chickens out has to get up in front of my Women's Studies 101 class and explain why, in excruciating detail, and answer questions afterwards." Lucy stuck out her hand, palm down. After a brief hesitation, Grace placed her hand gently on top of it. She shakily laid her hand on Grace's. She'd never have Rhys. Maybe flirting with Max was the next best thing. One thing was for sure, though. Given the parameters that Lucy had set, none of them was backing out of this challenge. "So, when do you leave for Sacramento?" Rhys called to Max. His brother wasn't paying any attention to him. Instead, he was staring at the floor, his brows flexed. Rhys sighed. It figured that the moment their dream was within reach, Max would get into one of his brooding moods. Normally, Rhys would tolerate and compensate for Max's moods, just like Max did for him. But with the recent back-to-back rehearsals combined with the time he was spending working the kinks out of the Dalton brothers' newest stage trick, the most spectacular one to date, his tolerance was spent. Next week's show had to go off without a hitch. Add to this stress the fact that Melina's birthday was coming up. Exhausted, didn't even begin to describe how he was feeling. "Max? Max!" Max blinked and straightened, his faraway gaze focusing on Rhys. "Sorry about that, I was just thinking." Behind him, Rhys snorted. "I thought we agreed that until we land the contract with 7 Seas, you'd let me do the thinking while you focused on flexing your muscles at the audience." "What would it matter? The audience rarely knows the difference." Rhys hung his head. When Max was right, he was right. The whole mystique around the Dalton twins' magic show was that the audience knew the magician performing that night was an identical twin. They just didn't know which one. Not until the end of the show. The problem was that he was more and more content to let Max be the performer so that he could do what he liked best, focus on managing the act and inventing new tricks. He'd had to step up the number of his own performances or risk losing the mystery hook altogether. Plus, once they unveiled their new trick, Rhys wouldn't get a reprieve for a good long time. Floating metamorphosis would be spectacular only if the audience saw both Dalton twins on stage at the same time. "I've had to double security since we caught Joey Salvador trying to sneak backstage. 7 Seas is insisting we come up with a G-rated proposal for their family night performances. And let's not forget that after tonight's show, I'm going to have to get everything packed up and shipped to Reno on my own while you jet to California for the weekend." Grim-faced, Max opened his mouth to respond, but a voice off stage stopped him. It was their father. "Boys, your mother's about to have a stroke. Jillian insists we need to shake things up for the 7 Seas folks and replace your black ties and cummerbunds with something that matches the girls' outfits. I think they're getting ready to battle it out. Come quick." He was sure his face reflected the same horror that Max's did. Their stage assistants wore shimmery sequined costumes in colors ranging from rose to fuchsia. No matter what Jillian called it, it was still pink to Rhys. "I'll go deal with Jillian." He paused, then muttered, "Tell Melina happy birthday for me." Rhys hadn't taken more than 4 steps before Max clapped a hand on his shoulder, yanking him back a step. "Why don't you tell her yourself? I know I haven't been pulling my weight lately. I'll stay. You use my ticket and surprise Melina." Max grinned. "See if she notices the switch this time." Rhys managed to smile. When they'd been younger, he and Max had played the same stupid games with Melina that they'd played with everyone else. They'd taken turns pretending to be one twin while subtly urging their victims to say something derogatory about the other. Melina was the only one who'd never fallen for it. Not once. She had an uncanny ability to tell them apart, even from a distance. That was one of the things that had drawn him to her in the first place. It was also why, when he found her kissing Max on the night of her 16th birthday, there'd been no telling himself she'd really meant to kiss him. Rhys's smile vanished at the memory. That kiss had interfered with 2 friendships over the years, his friendship with Melina and his friendship with his brother. Max and Melina's kiss had apparently been a one-time deal, but it had still inflamed the sense of discomfort he'd already felt when they were all together. He'd fought that discomfort for close to 10 years by trying to remain Melina's friend. All it had done was make it impossible for him to get over her. His plan had been working, though. By minimizing their contact over the past 2 years, he was finally beginning to miss her less. Hell, he could now go hours, days even, without thinking of her, and his focus was exactly where it should be, on his family, their act, and ensuring the continued success of both. Max gave him a shove. My ticket's in my dressing room. If you pack now, you can leave right after the show and... Shaking his head, Rhys couldn't quite meet his brother's eyes. I can't, he clipped out. There's too much to do. What's to do? The crew knows how to pack up without us. The Salvador brothers won't dare show their faces around here again, and as far as 7C's ridiculous request for a kiddie show goes, they can shove it. Rhys raised his brows pointedly, causing Max's words to trail off. He grimaced. Too much? Just a little. I can tone it down. I know Melina would love to see you. No, Rhys said, shaking his head again. You're the one she feels comfortable around. She always has. Rhys, she's not a kid anymore, and she's had a crush on you for years. Rhys jerked back as if his brother had hauled off and punched him. He immediately narrowed his eyes in warning. I'm not a substitute for you or anyone, Max. I never will be. His brother flushed guiltily. It was one kiss, and she didn't even initiate it. Yeah, so you told me, but we're talking ancient history. I got over her a long time ago. The two of them, mirror images, stared at each other, and it was Rhys's turn to flush. Unwilling to face his own dishonesty, he stared at the stage floor. When did you turn into a liar? Max asked quietly. And more importantly, when did you start to think I was an idiot? We work together, we're brothers. You don't think I can read you? Rhys's face jerked up. Yeah, well, maybe that's the problem. Now we have a problem? You think you know me, but you don't. Just like you don't really know Melina. If you did, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Even if she sees me as more than your stand-in, I can't give her what she wants any more than you can. I'm talking about stability. Roots. You know she's prime mother material. She's got a job she loves. She wants the white picket fence, 2.2 kids. I can't give that to her. Maybe she doesn't know what she wants. Maybe she wants to travel. Going on the road could be an adventure. She could travel. She chooses not to. Not even with her parents. Even if she'd consider it, it wouldn't be for the long term. You really think she'd do that to her kids? The childhood we had, Max. He lifted his arms and encompassed the entire theater in one sweeping motion. The life we have now isn't conventional. It's not what most people want. It sounds like maybe it's not what you want anymore. Is that it? Unease tickled at his brain. He could feel it. They were about to become big, really big, and he was used to the lifestyle. Maybe at one time he'd wanted something different, but that had been a grass is greener on the other side moment. Are you kidding? I've never liked traveling as much as you, but if we land this contract with 7Cs, we'll at least have our own theater. No more moving from one place to another every 2 weeks. We're at the top of our game. It's what you've always wanted. You mean we? What? Max stared at him. You mean it's what we've always wanted? Sure, you, Mom and Dad, me, we, that's what I meant. Uh-huh. Boys. Their dad poked his head around the corner, his sparse hair sticking up in tufts as if he'd been pulling at it. Fair warning, I'm not the one who's going to go on stage in sequins. I'm coming, Dad. Shaking his head, Rhys began walking backward. Look, I don't know how we got on this ridiculous topic. Melina and I are friends. I'm happy with the act. Everything's cool. Turning so he wouldn't have to see the doubt on his brother's face any longer, Rhys strode toward backstage. Over his shoulder, he called, Take her out. Make her feel special. And tell her I'll see her... Well, I'll see her sometime. Rhys forced himself to keep walking despite the little voice in his head screaming that he was a coward. Hell, he wasn't a coward. He was just realistic. He had his life, and Melina had hers. Plus, he'd told Max the truth. Their goals were so far apart they might as well live on opposite ends of the world. Still, he thought with a sigh after opening the door to the costume room, he'd been tempted by Max's offer more than he should have been. Especially because he'd wanted Melina to mistake him for Max. Just once, he'd have liked Melina to greet him the same way she did Max, with open arms and an open smile instead of a friendly but reserved attachment that always left him wanting more. Chapter 2. Dalton's Magic Rule Number 3. Learn from those with more experience. Teach me how to flirt with the man. Max, who'd just taken a gulp of his beer, choked on it and kept coughing until Melina rose from her chair and began slapping his back. Putting down the bottle, he raised his hands, wheezed, and gently nudged her away. "I'm fine. I think I misunderstood." Face flaming, but trying to act nonchalant, Melina returned to the chair next to the sofa, crossed her legs, and smoothed her wool skirt so that it covered her knees. "You heard me right. I want you to teach me how to flirt with the man." He stared at her with rounded eyes that quickly narrowed. Making a big show of looking around her small, neat living room, he muttered, "Is this a joke? Did Rhys put you up to this?" She leaned forward and waved her hand in front of his face, knowing it would annoy him. "Focus, Max. I'm not joking." Grinning now, Max swatted her hand away and wiggled his eyebrows up and down. "Will you stop?" she hissed. "I'm being serious here." She stood, turning her back to him, even as she hugged her arms close to her chest. Where were her friends and her Ben & Jerry's ice cream when she needed them? Knowing she had no choice, she forced herself to continue. I suck at flirting." Embarrassment threatened to swallow her whole, and she had to forcibly stop herself from running into the next room. Again, that moment of silence. "Says who?" Max growled. She studied her fingernails, frowning at how ragged they looked. She'd been chewing on them again. "Lots of people." "Lots?" "Okay, not lots. 3, but they would know." 3? Hell, Melina, that's not enough to conclude anything. "And who said it last? That bastard you broke up with 6 months ago?" For a woman who studies bugs for a living, you sure have a problem recognizing the less evolved of the male species. Melina sighed. Wasn't that the truth? But she had to stay focused. Well, not all men are fortunate to be famous entertainers whose female fans want them to sign their underwear. She heard Max rise and walk closer to her. "Yeah, it's a tough gig, but someone's got to do it. I, of course, am always happy to oblige." Sniffing, she raised her hand. "Of course, forgive me." His arms encircled her from behind. Resting his chin on her head, he just held her. As always, she felt protected in his arms, sheltered. But there was no zing of desire. None of the heat or shivers that overtook her when Rhys was near. On the plus side, there was no feeling like a moron and running away either. Not that it would have made a difference. Both Max and Rhys were way out of her league, and neither had ever shown the slightest bit of interest in her anyway. Sure, Max had always flirted and teased, told her to come see him when she wanted a real man. But she knew, as with everything else with him, it had all been a game. Unfortunately for him, she was calling his bluff. "If there were, issues," he cleared his throat. "They were his fault, Melina, not yours." She snorted and pulled away. "I wish that were true, but he's not the only boyfriend to tell me I don't know how to flirt, and according to his new girlfriend, he's the bomb." He winced. "Please, don't try to talk modern, it just doesn't work." "See what I mean?" she pouted. "I can't even talk sexy." "You don't need to talk sexy. Behind those god-awful glasses," he tapped the top of her wire-rimmed glasses for emphasis. "Lab coats and lumpy suits you wear, you are sexy. You just don't go around advertising it." "Right." "Melina," he said warningly. "I'm not putting myself down. I'm not beautiful, and I don't have the best body in the world, but I'm attractive. I dress well." His snort was getting rather annoying now. "And I'm smart. That counts for something, right?" "Melina." "I'm kind, loyal. I think I'd make a good mother." Max's eyes bugged out. Melina." She put her hands on her hips. "Oh, hush. I'm not asking you to father my child, and you don't have to look so relieved either. But we both know I'm not a femme fatale. I don't want to be. I just want to get married, have a family. A big one." She wanted lots of children, not an only child who would grow up lonely and longing for the type of sibling relationship that Max had with Rhys. "I don't want to wither up and die surrounded by a bunch of bugs." She dropped gracelessly onto her couch and leaned her head back against the cushion. His expression grew suspicious. "Is this about your biological clock? Honey, you're still young. There's plenty of time for you to start a family." When she didn't answer, he dropped down next to her and took her hands. "I thought you liked your bugs," Max said quietly. "Are you that unhappy? Why didn't you tell me?" She shook her head. "I love my job, but I want to be..." Her voice hitched. "I want to be loved. I want someone to love me." "Your parents love you. Rhys and we love you, Melina." My parents and you, maybe. Rhys, I'm not so sure of anymore. And anyway, it's not enough. I want a partner. But you're talking flirting mechanics, not love. One leads to the other, she insisted. With guys, flirting comes first, then emotion, right? He looked like he wanted the ground to open up and swallow him. Well, I guess, to some. To you, right? But I'm not the one you want to make fall in love with you. He said it hesitantly, as if he wasn't sure what her answer would be. No, he raked a hand through his golden hair. What's causing all this? You got your eye on someone specific? Her fingers plucked at the corded edge of one of the sofa cushions. Despite Lucy's fervent belief that she'd be settling with Jamie, there was something about the man that called to her. A sort of offbeat humor. A serious stare that pierced you and made you wonder what he was thinking, and whether he was thinking about you, the way Rhys's stare did. But unlike Rhys, he'd expressed interest in her, asked her out for drinks after the conference next weekend. And she wasn't going to mess up her opportunity with him. Not this time. Sort of. Sort of is a wimpy answer. She pounded the sofa cushion with her fist. Okay, I do. Let me guess, he's an academic? Well, of course. There's a conference next week that we're going to be presenting at. You're presenting at a conference? Since when? The last time you tried speaking at a public event, you almost passed out. Thank you for the reminder, she gritted out, but without much heat. He was right. She didn't do well in the spotlight. At the workshop Max was talking about, she'd stepped up to the podium only to become paralyzed with terror. She'd morphed from confident scientist into Cindy Brady, staring at a blinking red camera light despite the audience surrounding her. It wasn't an experience she'd ever sought to repeat again. That's why she'd chosen research in the safety and anonymity of her lab. That's what she was used to. That's what she was comfortable with. But with Jamie, things were different. He'd urged her to come out of her shell, and surprisingly, she'd agreed, confident that he would step up if it was too much for her. That alone must mean something, shouldn't it? Anyway, Jamie shouldn't be as hard to flirt with as, say, you or Rhys would be. If you could just do me this favor, horror came over her. I mean, you kissed me once. I know it didn't mean anything, but, well, the idea, it doesn't, gross you out, does it? What? Of course not. But he was looking panicked now. His hand moved to rub the back of his neck. It's just, I don't want you thinking there's anything wrong with you. You're just... An amateur at flirting, she suggested. Well, I was going to say selective, but given the men you've chosen, you obviously haven't been picking from the cream of the crop. What's that supposed to mean? Please, I've met the guys. They were all smart, influential. Okay, so they're not tall and handsome and fly to London to perform for the Queen, but they were pansies. Jamie is not a pansy, and the others were just uninspired. Melina. She shook her head. Tell me the truth. You go for experienced women. Well, sure, but... In the insect world, bugs mate for one reason and one reason only, because they get something out of it. I want a mate, Max. I want to know how to keep one. So if it doesn't disgust you to flirt with me, can you please do me this favor? He seemed to think about it. Why me? Why not Rhys? Because I'm not safe with Rhys, she thought. Not the way I am with you. With Rhys, she'd lose herself. She'd start believing in unicorns and flying dragons and mutual passion leading to lifelong happiness. She'd want more than she could have. Why Rhys and not you, she hedged. Come on, Melina. Look, are you going to do it or not? I'll ask you again. Why me? Because I trust you. What if I say no? Then I'll find someone else. Rhys? Oh, what is your obsession with your brother? I want you to tell me who you'll go to if I say no. She shrugged. What does that mean? You just flirt with some stranger? Haven't you? Fascinated, she watched him turn red. We're not talking about me. Actually, we are talking about you for flirting lessons, and that's exactly what I'm asking for. Chapter 3. Dalton's Magic Rule, Number 4. Melina stared at the 3 brass numbers affixed to Max's hotel room door. They hadn't changed in the 5 minutes she'd been standing there looking at them. She had the right room. She had everything she needed. Let the flirting education begin. She could do that, right? 5 minutes later, still standing in the same location, she thought apparently not. She leaned her forehead on the door and thumped it twice. The second time, not so gently. What are you waiting for? Max was gorgeous. He cared about her. Plus, she'd sworn him to secrecy. Other than Lucy and Grace, who'd expect a full report, no one knew about this but the two of them. She'd just look upon it as an experiment. 2 days of trial runs and data analysis. Then Max would get on a plane to Vegas or wherever his next show was, and the next time they saw each other, she'd be happy and in love with Jamie. Maybe she'd even be pregnant if the next Dalton Twins magic show tour went on for a while. The image of her holding a baby cinched it. She stuck the card in the slot, waited for the green light, and pushed the door open. In the lobby bar, Rhys watched Max check his watch for about the 10th time. His brother was acting weird, no two ways about it. Leaning back in his chair, he raised his hand and wiggled his fingers. Spill it. Huh? What's going on? You've been acting like a nervous Nelly since I got here. What did Melina say that you couldn't tell me on the phone? Max's brow quirked. Nervous Nelly? You know what I mean, butthead. Now what the hell's going on? Butthead, your skill with words is mind-boggling. At Rhys's low growl, Max held up his hands. All right already, will you just ease up? I already told you it wasn't an emergency. Rhys barely refrained from grabbing his brother by the throat. Your exact message was something weird is going on with Melina. You refused to answer any of my calls. Would you have gotten on the plane if I'd said I needed your advice about something? Rhys slapped his palms on the table. Max, I don't have time for this. You have 10 seconds to start talking, or I'm driving back to the airport. It's her birthday. Stunned, Rhys stared at him for several seconds before answering. Yeah, I know. That's why I told you to tell her happy birthday. It's also why he'd thrown her present in his suitcase during his frantic rush to get a flight, just in case. Max lifted his drink, water instead of his usual beer, and took a healthy swallow. Rhys narrowed his eyes. What was going on here? All that stuff you said about her wanting the white picket fence and 2.2 kids, that stuff doesn't matter, Max said softly. You're hurting her. The accusation caught him off guard, but he couldn't deny it either. He looked away. She's not an idiot, Rhys. She recognizes that you've pulled away, that you don't call, you don't visit. Hell, she's certain you forgot her birthday. And why wouldn't she? You two barely say anything to each other anymore. Rhys gritted his teeth. She works with her bugs, visits her parents once a month, dates safe, nice guys. What else is there to know? How about what that so-called ex-boyfriend of hers did to her? Rhys sat straight up. Was that what Max's call had been about? What had been the loser's name? Bradley? Brian? Yeah, Brian. Had he hurt her? Hit her? A slow but intense wash of anger began to pump in his veins. What? Max shook his head in disgust. Nothing. Forget I said anything. Rhys stood, braced his hands on the table, and got nose to nose with his brother. I'm not forgetting anything. Tell me, did he hurt her? Max leaned back and spread out his hands in a welcoming gesture. And what if he did? I'll kill him. Rhys spit out from between his teeth. Max stared at him, then grinned. I believe you would. What are you grinning at? I'd think you'd be right in line with me. I know I would. I'm just surprised you said it out loud. Where Melina is concerned, you're prone to changing the subject. Straightening, Rhys raked his hands through his hair. Since when has there ever been any question that I care about Melina? She's one of the sweetest, most intriguing women I know, and we've known her for years. Hell, Mom and Dad would get in line to beat the guy up too. Then why? If you care so much about her, why don't you finally lay it on the table? Rhys shook his finger. Oh no, we're not having that conversation again. Stop playing games, Max. I just want to know if Melina's okay and whether I'm going to have to kill anyone tonight. Max shrugged. She's okay. Her boyfriend bruised her pride, that's all. She's more hurt by your callous actions than anything else. I know you didn't want to come here, but I'm not apologizing. You can damn well say happy birthday to her face. Rhys practically fell into his chair. He wanted to rail at his brother for his deceptive tactics, but his own guilt weighed on him heavily. He hadn't thought that his pulling away would hurt Melina that much. Then again, he hadn't thought beyond wanting to stop his pain. But Max was right. Melina was his friend. It wasn't her fault he wanted her to be more. First thing in the morning, I promise. Good. You still going to fly to Reno? Right after I see her. We don't have to be in Reno for another few days. You're obsessing. The last time we worked the Magic Underground, the backstage crew was a disaster. And you weren't the one caught trying to do an omni-deck in front of 500 people only to flounder when it didn't happen. I'm not going to let something like that happen when the 7 Seas contract is at stake. His brother reached out and placed his hand on Rhys's arm. You've always been the brains behind our success, Rhys. I know that, and so do Mom and Dad. No one can take that success away from us, even if we don't end up getting 7 Seas. A little stunned by Max's admission, Rhys said, We'll get the contract, so long as everything goes as planned. Max gave a curt nod, then stood. Rhys looked at him in surprise. Where you headed? There's a blonde at the bar who's eyeballing us. Rhys didn't even bother looking at the woman. Go ahead, I'm going to turn in. I'm beat. Yeah, you really should turn in. It's been a hell of a decade on the road, don't you think? It's been fun. The best. Max nodded, then grinned. Get all the rest you can, you hear? I'll see you not so bright and early Monday morning at the Magic Underground. Rhys watched his brother approach the blonde, who looked at Rhys and waved. Rhys smiled and waved back, his public persona firmly in place, but he swiftly turned away. He dismissed the idea of having another beer. He hadn't been exaggerating when he said he was tired. He'd had to catch 2 layovers to fly from Kentucky to Sacramento. Of course, being that it was last minute, the flight had cost a small fortune. In the end, it hadn't mattered. Even before Max had called, Rhys had been getting ready to book a flight. Max's call had just added some panic to the long trip. He couldn't let Melina think he'd forgotten her birthday. As much as it would solidify the distance he'd been gradually establishing between them, he couldn't hurt her that way. Instinctively, he knew it would be a hurt he couldn't repair, and the thought of making that final break had been terrifying, as had been his sudden, inexplicable certainty that she needed him. Maybe it was some kind of twin telepathy or something. Melina had clearly confided her relationship troubles to Max and sworn him to secrecy. The idea of Melina or Max keeping secrets from him was unsettling, but not surprising. Why would she confide in him when he'd been doing his best to push her away? More disturbing was the idea that her ex had hurt her. Possessiveness swamped him, but he easily pushed it down. He'd had so much practice at it, after all. Melina wasn't his, but she was still someone extremely special to him. If someone had hurt her, even if it was just her pride, he'd pay for it. Rhys would make sure of that. Excuse me? Rhys glanced up at the soft feminine voice. It was the blonde from the bar. Frowning, he glanced over his shoulder but saw no sign of Max. Your brother was telling me about your act. He's going to get his car. I was wondering if you'd mind company. My friend Jocelyn over there. She pointed to a rail-thin brunette who was sitting at the bar and watching them. Is a doll, and I'd feel horrible abandoning her. But she'd still do it, Rhys thought, trying not to judge his brother's taste in women. He'd made plenty of bad decisions in his life, so he had no business judging anyone. Shaking his head, he began to rise. I'm sorry, but I was just about to. Hi. The brunette strode up to his table and held out her hand. I am so thrilled to meet you. I absolutely love your magic act. Would you mind if I join you? Sighing, Rhys sat back in his chair and watched as the blonde backed away, waved, and beelined for the exit, presumably to meet his brother. He focused on the brunette. She was decked out, fit, and had a charming smile, but he just wanted to go up to bed. Alone. The last thing he wanted was to talk about magic right now. But he didn't want to be rude to a fan either. So where did you see the act? He asked, catching the eye of the waiter and indicating he wanted another beer. As Melina entered the hotel room, she half expected Max to have done it up. Candles, flowers, something. But it was in its normal state, the linen straightened and the towels in the bathroom folded neatly, indicating that housekeeping had come and gone. Melina let out a sigh of relief. Max was sticking to the plan, making this weekend exactly what she wanted. A straightforward tutoring session rather than something resembling a romantic rendezvous. Setting her single bag on the bed, she noticed that Max had traveled pretty light himself. A suitcase in the corner, along with a familiar-looking magic case that held his cards and smaller close-up tricks. An evil urge to open the case and rifle through it took hold of her, but of course she couldn't do it. A magician's bag of tricks was his sacred possession. Neither Max nor Rhys had ever broken the magician's code by telling her how a trick was performed. Of course, she'd done her own research on the internet, but never told them that. They would have been appalled. Growing up with professional magicians as parents had made Max and Rhys not just passionate about the craft, but mystical in many ways. They talked as if they actually believed it was possible to make a card appear from thin air, and they wanted her to have such belief as well. Lucky for her, her scientific mind couldn't subscribe to such fodder. It was always better to deal with concretes. That way you could calculate the risks and predict the outcome. Even then, the world was a scary place. Add something like magic to the equation? No thanks. It didn't take her very long to unpack, and soon she found herself sitting on the edge of the bed, trying to stop herself from bolting. Chewing on one nail, she glanced at the hotel clock. 7:30 p.m. Max had told her he would be back to the hotel room close to 8:30 p.m. and to get comfortable and wait for him. And by comfortable, I don't mean sweats and a ratty t-shirt, Melina. Bring something sexy to wear, he'd ordered. Wear your hair down and ditch the glasses. But I can't see well without my glasses, she'd protested. I mean, I won't run into walls, but I'll miss the finer details. Something like satisfaction sparked in his eyes, but then his expression went blank. Don't you have contacts? No, they're uncomfortable. Shaking his head with amusement, he said, Just do it, babe. Then he'd leaned forward, kissed her forehead as he'd done so many times in the past, and got up to leave. Before closing the door, however, he'd turned back to her. You sure about this? Of course she wasn't sure. She'd wanted to scream, but he'd already said yes. I'm sure, she'd said. After all, tomorrow's my birthday. What could be better for me than a little continuing education? Education? What a dork, she'd thought. Thankfully, he'd just smiled. That's right. Remember, no glasses, okay? Are they really that ugly? She'd asked hesitantly, lifting one hand to touch the wire frames she'd once thought were quite stylish. All he'd done was close the door, loudly singing Happy Birthday to You as he walked down the walkway to his car. She'd felt so self-satisfied then, giddy that he'd agreed to help her. Now she stared at the single large piece of luggage that had been laid across the luggage rack as if it contained something horrible. Desperately, she searched the room, her gaze landing on the minibar. She rushed to it, opened the door, and stared at the little bottles of alcohol. She'd seen a stocked minibar before, but she'd never actually drank from it. Too expensive. Plus, the little bottles of alcohol had seemed silly somehow. Right now, silly seemed appropriate, and she was desperate to calm her jittery nerves. Taking out the 5 small bottles, she lined them up on top of the dresser and perused the selection. One finger tapping her pursed lips, she selected one bottle. Unscrewing the cap, she took a swig. And gasped. Holy moly, that burned! The second swig, not so much. By the time she took her third, she was already starting to feel better. She set the bottle down, then looked at the clock. It was almost 8. Max would be here soon. Closing her eyes, she opened herself to the memory of that long-ago night. Rhys had asked her to meet him in her parents' gazebo the night of her Sweet 16 party. He had something special he wanted to give her, he'd said, and something important to tell her. Imagination going wild and hope soaring, she'd waited in that gazebo for over an hour before Max had come out to find her. When she'd asked about Rhys, Max had stalled. But Melina had kept pushing until Max finally admitted that Rhys was making out with Trisha James, the busty blonde cheerleader who lived next door and the one whom Melina's parents had bullied her into inviting. She'd sobbed all over poor Max's shirt, and then, feeling sorry for her, he'd kissed her. Even then, she hadn't been ignorant of his skill. That slow, gentle, open-mouthed kiss still ranked high on her kissometer. By the time Rhys had shown up outside, Trisha by his side, Melina had been able to control her hurt and make a dignified exit. She'd always been grateful to Max for his compassion that night. That's why she knew he wouldn't let her down now. Another quick glance at the clock confirmed she had about 20 more minutes until he showed up. Just a little more whiskey courage, she thought. She was on the last bottle, an enjoyable buzz simmering inside her, when she remembered Max's third request, her glasses. She took them off, stared blurrily at the fragile frames, and moved to put them on the nightstand. She hesitated. With a shrug, she tossed the glasses in the direction of the armchair, wincing when she heard them bounce against something hard. No matter. She had a spare pair in her purse and more at home. Rhys got off the elevator and moved wearily toward his hotel room. He was standing in front of his door and fishing his key card from his pocket when he suddenly froze. Head tilted back, he took a deep breath. He smelled lemon, a fresh, clean scent that he always associated with Melina because of the shampoo her mother had customized for her long, curly brown locks. His gut clenched as he replayed his conversation with Max. His brother had landed 2 blows over the course of 2 days. The first by exposing his feelings for Melina. The second by accusing him of hurting her. Both right on the mark. He didn't want to hurt Melina. That was the last thing he wanted. But after over a decade of having what he wanted just within his reach, but knowing he couldn't have it, he needed to move on. Hell, he and Max were celebrities. Women threw themselves at him. The brunette he'd left at the bar had made it clear she was interested in more than his autograph and had seemed genuinely disappointed when he'd wished her good night. Still, while 1 or 2 had managed to catch his attention for more than a night over the years, they'd never been able to make him feel the way he felt when he was with Melina, as though a part of him had long been chopped off and magically reattached, like a deck of cards missing all its aces until someone slipped them back in. It was a feeling that even the thundering applause of a packed theater in Caesar's Palace couldn't compete with. But it was an illusion. She'd already shown she preferred Max's company by a wide mile. Plus, beyond physical attraction on his part, and possibly on hers, they weren't compatible. And he didn't want to spend his life arguing with her or disappointing her just to be proved right. Shaking his head, he slipped the key card in and entered the hotel room. Immediately he tensed, his sharp vision homing in on the woman lying in his bed, her eyes sleepily blinking open as she propped herself up on one elbow. Her hair, usually pulled back, tumbled around her face like a cloud of mink. Like a man under a spell, he walked into the room. Stumbled was probably more like it. He heard the loud click of the door closing behind him. She smiled. "Hi." Chapter 4. Dalton's Magic Rule Number 5. Get up close and personal. Part of Melina knew she should be freaking out. She couldn't quite comprehend why she wasn't. She felt like super goddess woman, like she could do anything. Swinging her feet over the side of the bed, she stood, then immediately threw out a steadying hand when she swayed. Whoa, not wearing her glasses was not only putting a hazy edge to her vision, but throwing her equilibrium off balance too. Shaking back her hair, her hands still gliding over the bed covers for balance, she skirted around the mattress towards Max. Max hadn't moved. They couldn't have that. Raising her arm, she turned in a slow circle, ending with her hands resting on her hips. "Well, is this sexy enough for you?" Sexy enough. Was she sexy enough for him? Rhys licked his lips, but was careful not to make any sudden moves. If he was losing his marbles, he wasn't about to do anything to rattle his brain back to life. With her simple camisole and boy-short underwear, she was showing less skin than women often showed at the pool. Hell, the girls wore less material on stage. But this was Melina, and he was seeing parts of her he'd never seen before. "Are you okay?" His gaze jumped to hers. A small furrow had formed between her brows. As he watched, her already pink cheeks flushed until they were cherry red. He saw the moment insecurity began to replace her bravado. That jerked him out of his daze fast. Moving the last few steps toward her, he raised his hand, stroked her hair from her face, then cupped the back of her neck. With his other hand, he tilted her chin up. "I'm good. Better than good. I just never thought you'd actually do it. Come to me, I mean." "Of course I would, silly. It's my birthday present to myself." Rhys's chest tightened. He was her birthday present? Since when? Was it because he hadn't called her? That he'd tried his best to drive her away? Had maintaining his distance finally made Melina realize how much she wanted him? If so, the agony had been worth it. "You've got it wrong, sweetheart. You're giving me the present, and it's not my birthday for another 6 months." But what about his reasons for staying away from her? His inner and wholly annoying voice interrupted. The picket fence, the 2.2 kids. He slapped the voice away fast. He wasn't thinking about that. He couldn't. Not with Melina in front of him. He bent down, and her eyes narrowed in that adorable semi-squint again. When his closed lips touched hers, it was like diving into heaven. Chapter 5. Dalton's Magic Rule Number 6. Seize every opportunity to perform. "You hog the covers, Ladybug." Melina's eyes snapped open, and for a moment her dream and reality vied for supremacy. Reality, her vision was just as it should be without her glasses and first thing in the morning. A little fuzzy, but not enough to prevent her from seeing that there was a man lying next to her. Dream, the man was Rhys, his head propped on his bent arm. A joy she'd never experienced slammed into her, but then disappeared almost immediately when reality took the lead. This was Max, she remembered. And as much as she loved and adored Max, he wasn't Rhys, and he never would be. "Max, thank you." Gripping her chin, he turned her face toward him, not unkindly, but not gently either. "Who am I?" She frowned. "What?" "Who am I?" "You." She squinted, but the picture didn't change. He was Max, honey-colored hair, slightly shorter than she remembered from 2 days before, but he could have gotten a haircut. Strong nose and jaw, broad shoulders and chest. She sucked in a breath and held it. 2 memories from last night formed. The first, his seeming surprise when he'd come into the room. She'd chalked it up to nerves, but had it been more? The second, he'd called her Ladybug. Only Rhys called her Ladybug. But Rhys wasn't here. He didn't even like her anymore. Plus, he wouldn't have known to come to her, unless... "Rhys?" she whispered. Already half expecting his answer, she rose and pulled the sheet up with her. His expression flashed with confirmation. "Melina," he said warningly, grabbing for the sheet, but she moved quick and with desperation, winning the tug-of-war so she could back up toward the door. And do what? Prove herself to be an even bigger idiot? She compensated by taking a sidestep toward the open bathroom doorway. He stood. "Come here, Ladybug," he said quietly. She shook her head. "You're Max. Tell me you're Max." He crossed his arms over his chest, standing proud and tall. "I'm sorry. I can't do that." With her one free hand, she covered her mouth to stifle her moan of horror. She felt her knees about to buckle and put a steadying hand on the wall. She'd needed to steady herself on the bed last night, she remembered. She'd thought it was because she wasn't wearing her glasses, but it had more likely been because of the alcohol. "Melina," he began again. She shook her head. Now that she knew, it seemed so obvious. His hair was shorter. He spoke more slowly. He touched her differently, more hesitantly. More and more hesitantly as time went on. Now a hollow feeling of betrayal burned along with her embarrassment and heartache. "Whose room is this?" "Mine." "Not Max's." "Max is on a different floor." A different floor. So had the front desk made a mistake? Why, what are you doing here? "I flew in to give you your birthday present. It's right on the dresser. Didn't you see it?" Holding out his hands as if she was a rabid dog about to bite him, he nevertheless took 2 steps toward her, skirting the bed much like she had the night before. She moved backward, matching him step for step, suddenly feeling like a tiny rabbit being stalked by a very hungry wolf. "Let's talk." Talk. What was there to talk about other than her wanting to die from humiliation? "You weren't expecting me." He froze and seemed to weigh his words carefully before answering. "No, but you didn't want this." "Now, that's not true." She laughed even as she wiped at the tears gathered in her eyes. "Oh, is that why you've been hounding me with so much attention? Who are you dating now, Rhys? I'll bet she looks just like me, doesn't she?" The look that flashed across his face was subtle, but she caught it. She remembered the picture on her bookcase, the one where he posed with a woman Hugh Hefner would have been proud of. She'd had Barbie-like dimensions. Melina was barely a B-cup, and her hourglass shape was bottom-heavy. She probably wouldn't have been allowed to clean the Playboy mansion, let alone live there. As she came even with the open bathroom doorway, he shook his head. "Melina, please don't. Just go," she whispered. She saw him tense, saw him shift on the balls of his feet, and knew he was going to lunge for her. But he was too far away. He'd never make it in time. Which is why he cursed when she propelled herself into the bathroom, shut the door, and locked it. The heavy thump of a fist against the door made her flinch, but he didn't call out to her. He did mutter a slow, steady stream of cuss words that would have amused her if she hadn't been so devastated. Rhys had plenty of surprises up his sleeves, including a hot temper. Slowly she sank to the floor, crawled under the open space of the double sink, and curled into a corner. No matter what he said, he hadn't wanted her. She wasn't strong enough to risk this kind of hurt again, and that included Jamie. When Rhys left, she would get dressed and drive home. Then she'd throw herself into her work instead of silly dreams of a family and children. Right after she killed Max. His gaze never leaving the closed bathroom door, Rhys tugged on fresh clothes, cursing the whole time. She'd thought he was Max. Hurt and anger fought for supremacy. He wanted to rip his brother apart. Wanted to yell at her for daring to ask his brother for such a stupid, idiotic, lame-brained, ridiculous, personal, intimate favor. She believed her ex-boyfriend so much that she'd sought out tutoring lessons on how to flirt with a man? From Max? Raking his hands through his hair, he stopped staring at the door long enough to pace. And his brother had agreed, only to back out in the end. It didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that given their conversation at the theater and in the bar last night, he'd thought to pave the way for Rhys. Pausing, he took a deep breath and sat on the bed. He eyed Melina's overnight case and knew she wouldn't come out of the bathroom until she thought he was gone. Grabbing the overnight case, he thought about throwing it down the hallway. Instead, he shoved it under the desk, out of view. He wasn't going to make leaving him easy for her. Falling back on the bed, he stared at the ceiling and allowed himself to process things. He was upset, yes, but he was also thinking clear-headedly now. His clear-headed thinking was one of the things that made the act with his brother work. Offstage, Max was clearly the more extroverted. His passion and enthusiasm for performing were what pumped up Rhys's genuine but more quiet interest in magic. Unlike his brother, Rhys wasn't impulsive, ever. He thought things through, whether it was the believability of a magic trick, what position in the room gave him the best advantage when it came to illusion, or whether a woman was hitting on him for his fame rather than a true interest in the man he was. While there were more of the former than the latter, that didn't necessarily mean he'd turn a woman down just because she liked the limelight. He just liked to know what he was getting into from the beginning. That way, he maintained control from beginning to end, just like with his magic. He decided what people saw and didn't see. He made things happen. But not with Melina. He'd never had that kind of control with her, and that more than anything else was probably what had kept him away from her. If he couldn't even control his feelings for her, what made him think that if he ever had her, he'd be able to leave? And leaving was always what he and his brother did. It was in their blood. He couldn't imagine staying in one place day after day, month after month, working the same job, even for Melina. Or, more precisely, he could imagine it, but he couldn't accept such bliss was actually possible. Not on his part, and not on hers. The first thing he'd thought when she'd called him Max was, not again. He loved his brother, but sometimes he felt like he lived in his shadow. That no one truly saw him for who he was because they were always a pair. The only thing that stopped him from freaking out completely was the fact she'd said his name last night. Her defenses had been down, and she clearly hadn't realized Max hadn't shown up. But she'd still said his name. That meant a lot. Right now, that meant everything. His right shoulder itched with intuition just before the phone rang. Rolling over, he reached for the phone and picked it up, knowing immediately who it was. "You are so dead." Silence, then a hesitant, "Where's Melina?" "Listen, you little—" "If that's your brother," Melina yelled from the bathroom, "you can tell him he's a dead man when I see him." "Already done, Ladybug," he called through his clenched teeth. "She's still there?" Max sounded so proud of himself that Rhys tightened his hand on the receiver, wishing it was his brother's neck. "So what's the problem, man? Exactly what did you think was going to happen, Max?" "Was she wearing something sexy?" Rhys remembered the little shorts and top she had been wearing, modest and simple by most standards, and currently lying on the floor. Flannel pajamas. Damn, and her hair? Loose and gorgeous, feeling more relaxed, Rhys stretched out on the bed, only to tense when he heard the bathroom door unclick. Feigning disinterest, he stayed on the bed as Melina peeked out from around the corner, her hands clutching her sheet while she searched for the bag he'd moved under the desk. Pinned back in that bun of hers. "And the glasses?" Max groaned. "The glasses? But ugly as ever." He looked straight at her when he said it, and she wrinkled her nose and stuck out her tongue at him. He sat up, and despite the fact he was fully clothed, he didn't miss the way she kept sneaking looks at his body. Unlike similar glances other women gave him, her hesitant assessment made his chest puff out and his heart pound out of control. "So what the hell did you guys do all night?" "What do you think we did? We played rummy, watched a girly movie, and I ended up sleeping on the floor." Melina covered her mouth to hide her smile of relief, but he saw it anyway. He cocked an eyebrow at her. "No sparks?" "More like Mount St. Helens." "Not a one." Max sighed. "Well, hey, I'm sorry, man. I really thought, I don't know. I just thought if I finally pushed the two of you into taking a chance." Almost feeling sorry for his brother now, Rhys smiled and rose. "You're still dead when I see you." "So Melina's okay?" His smile widened until a grin split his face. While she remained frozen where she stood, wrapped in the sheet like a Grecian goddess, both determination and anticipation rolled through him. He stared at her. What he might have done or should have done before no longer mattered. By the time he was through with her, she'd know exactly the kind of power she held over a man. She's going to be fine. In fact, she's going to be fabulous. While his brother squawked and started asking questions, Rhys hung up on him. He planted his hands on his hips and thrust his jaw out aggressively. "You ready for your next flirting lesson, Ladybug?" "Game on." Melina stared at Rhys and shifted uneasily from one foot to the other. Next flirting lesson? Was he crazy or was she? After 3 failed relationships, she didn't believe it was better to love and lose rather than never to have loved before, especially not with Rhys. She loved him. She'd always loved him. But that love, combined with his pulling away from her, had caused her far too much pain of late. If she was honest with herself, Rhys had hurt her far worse than Brian ever could. And that was not something she was going to ignore. If she held any place in his heart still, she'd have to content herself with that. She wasn't going to voluntarily seek out more only to have him walk away from her again. She turned toward the bathroom. I feel it only fair to warn you that if you try to hide in the bathroom again, I'll just have to break the door down." Surprise came first, then she couldn't help it. She laughed. She laughed long and hard. When she finally managed to control herself and look at him, he was frowning fiercely. "Glad to know the idea of me exerting enough strength to break down a door amuses you." It was the idea of him exerting such effort for her that had made her laugh, but she didn't tell him that. Shaking her head, she bit her lip. "I'm sorry, it's not that. I just laugh when I'm nervous." Plus, Rhys had just told Max what he normally thought of her. With her, men expected flannel pajamas, pinned-back hair, butt-ugly glasses. Weren't those the same words Max had used to describe her choice in eye decor? Even as she appreciated Rhys's discretion, she wondered if it was because he was too embarrassed to admit that he'd actually done anything with her. The thought pierced a tender spot inside her when she'd thought she'd guarded those softer places long ago. So I make you nervous. Why is that, do you think? Any trace of humor slipped and she averted her gaze. So he knew he made her nervous, big deal. Like he hadn't already figured that out a long time ago with the way she always flushed and stuttered around him. Can you give me my overnight bag? I thought I left it. I gave it to a passing bellboy while you were in the bathroom. You did not. He shrugged. No, I didn't. But I did hide it. I don't want you getting dressed and rushing out of here before we talk. But that's... She sputtered. Childish? Hey, desperate times and all that. But if you want to look around, then by all means. He waved his hand in invitation. For a moment, she just stared at him. What was motivating him to be so difficult about this? He had to know she was embarrassed about the mix-up, yet he was forcing her to confront him. Why wouldn't he just let it go? Why was he getting so much pleasure from her humiliation? The answer came to her so suddenly that she felt foolish for not thinking of it sooner. This was obviously about the competitive male ego. He was probably offended that she'd asked Max for the favor and not him. Well, he didn't need any more ego-stroking from her. Her performance last night should have already told him that she was putty in his hands. She glanced around but didn't see her bag anywhere. Her purse, however, was by the television. She snatched her purse, rifled through it, and found her spare glasses. With a mutinous thrust of her chin, she put them on. Her vision immediately focused, making her feel slightly calmer. Why didn't you tell Max what happened when he called? Because what happens between you and me has nothing to do with him. He looked so fierce, so possessive that she shivered. In this case it did. He tricked you, didn't he? He didn't trick me. He just didn't tell me what was waiting for me. And if he had? If he had, I wouldn't have waited, liar, she whispered. You haven't called, you haven't visited, you haven't wanted anything to do with me. Not because I didn't want you. He hesitated. You didn't exactly advertise that you wanted me. I didn't... Don't lie, he commanded, cupping the back of her head and pulling her into his chest. With his other hand, he rubbed her lower back. We've lied to each other enough, don't you think? You might have picked Max to be your tutor, but it was my name you said before you fell asleep last night. And I want you, Melina. I'm willing to say it. I'm willing to act on it. Doubt and suspicion boiled inside her. Why now, after all this time? Because you offered it to me. I pushed it on you. That's a stupid thing to say, and you're not stupid. Yes, well, here's where my stupidity ends. Pulling away, she urged, If you'll just get me my clothes, I'll get out of here. Why were you willing to let him teach you, but not me? Ah, so she had been right. This was about his male ego. Because he was around, for one. I'm here now, and I've got the weekend, just like you and Max agreed, right? Alarm bells blared in her head. Yes, but... And I think we established last night that we have chemistry. He said it quietly, with none of the cockiness that would have made her question her attraction to him. Instead, Melina struggled to breathe in the rapidly thinning air. Your skill has never been in question. It's my ability to flirt with a man, that is. Says you. Says Brian Montgomery, Lars Jensen, Gary Samata. Idiots. If they wanted something from you, they didn't work hard enough for it. Besides, I can show you how to flirt with a man. The alarm in her head was still sounding, but somehow it had quieted a bit. Curiosity, she told herself, that's all. She wasn't actually going to consider his proposition, was she? At her continued silence, he pressed on. Don't get me wrong, I'm not immune to some satisfaction as well. I put in some work last night. I think I'm entitled to a little return on my investment, don't you? Okay. Her curiosity was definitely getting the better of her now. Melina forced herself not to think of Rhys's special brand of inspiration. We barely know each other anymore. You know that's not true. Like you said, Melina, we're almost family. What we're doing this weekend might not fit within the boundaries of our previous relationship, but once it's over, I want to know you're going to be okay. I can help you. Why won't you let me? Once it's over, he'd said. Once he was gone, he meant. A wave of sadness washed over her. If she understood him correctly, this was to be their swan song to whatever relationship they'd been clinging to, sort of like his parting gift to her. Since it had been coming for a while, she tried not to show how much the thought devastated her, or swayed her. As soon as the weekend was over, he'd be leaving again. Who knew when she'd see him next? She'd be a fool not to take what he was offering. And then what, she forced herself to ask, even though she already knew the answer. What were you going to do after you and Max were done flirting with each other? We were going to part friends, go back to the way things always were. No expectations, no embarrassment. He seemed to hesitate for a moment, then said, I can do that. Can you? Given his cavalier attitude, what else could she say? Slowly she nodded. Satisfaction gleamed in his eyes. Good. He moved forward and she tensed, expecting him to reach out and kiss her. Anticipation streaked through her, but all he did was turn, bend his knees slightly, and retrieve a familiar-looking bag from under the desk. He tossed it onto the bed next to her. Now get dressed. She stared at the bag blankly. Now you want me to get dressed? He smiled slightly. Yep. Why? He cocked an eyebrow at her. Because, my dear Melina, the next flirting lesson involves something the best magicians know how to work with a very subtle yet sure hand. What's that? She whispered. Unpredictability. Chapter 6. Dalton's Magic Rule Number 7. Don't forget your magic wand. As he turned Melina's car onto the freeway that would lead them north of Sacramento, Rhys had to struggle not to show his amusement. Although she was valiantly trying to act nonchalant, he'd definitely thrown her off balance, which was exactly the response he'd been hoping for. He hadn't been lying when he'd told her that unpredictability was key to good magic. It was also the key to getting Melina to lower her guard and stop those gigantic wheels in her mind from trying to analyze everything to death. God knew if he was going to participate in her ridiculous flirting experiment, he was going to enjoy every second of their time together. He wanted the same for her. He wanted her relaxed and with her guard down, enjoying their time together instead of focusing on things like technique. She cleared her throat. So where are we going? She asked, as if he hadn't already refused to answer her the 4 other times she'd asked. He turned to look at her with a carefree grin. That wouldn't exactly keep the mystery going now, would it? She pouted so adorably that he barely stopped himself from grabbing her chin and pulling her over for a kiss. It didn't take a genius to figure out that his ladybug instinctively resisted anything that she couldn't control. He obviously needed to steer her mind to safer ground. How are your parents, by the way? The question wiped the pout off her mouth, and she sat back. They're good. They're in China now, checking out the Great Wall. We were there a couple of years ago. It was an amazing trip. They've been traveling for the last couple of years, right? And things are still good between them? Sure, why wouldn't they be? He thought of all the fights his parents had gotten into while on the road, just another thing he'd had to learn to adjust to. It's a miracle that my parents' marriage survived their touring. Sometimes I think they brought us along with them as a buffer just to keep their marriage intact. She shifted slightly in her seat, turning closer to him instead of continuing to hug the door. But your parents seem so compatible. I don't think I've ever seen them fight. He couldn't help his smirk. Yes, but you only saw them at home. They're completely different on the road. You ever see that show, The Amazing Race? Sure, I love it actually. You're not saying... All those pairs trying to navigate around foreign countries under intense pressure, that doesn't exactly bring out the best in them, right? Well, let's just say my mom shows a whole different side of herself when she's tired or hungry, and my dad seems to lose his ability to read her when he's distracted and on the road. Was that hard for you, that they fought a lot? It had been at one time, until he'd realized it was just part of his parents' process. They fought on the road and probably made up just as fiercely. Once he'd realized their love was solid enough to withstand the fighting, he'd stop stressing about it. He, on the other hand, wasn't willing to put up with that kind of strife in his personal relationships. Rhys? Melina reached out and took his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. Affection washed over him. Melina was such a doll, with a generous heart and fierce loyalty. She would make some lucky guy a wonderful wife, some child a wonderful mother. For a moment, disappointment that he wouldn't be that husband and that it wouldn't be their child spiked through him. He squeezed her hand back and shot her a quick smile. Sorry, I spaced there for a second. What did you ask? How are they doing now? They're learning to enjoy one another again, but they're still on the road with us about half the time. Dad's our manager, you know, and Mom's mentored each of our female stage assistants. They'll always be part of the act in that way. Is that a drag for you and Max when they're with you? He frowned when she pulled her hand away. When he glanced at her, she was looking out the window and blushing. His eyebrows shot up. Just what was his little ladybug referring to? Not at all. Why? I can't imagine it's conducive to, she waved her hand in a yada-yada circle. You have a lot of women interested in you on the road. I'm not naive enough to think that you don't take advantage of it. Internally, he winced. The last thing he wanted to discuss with Melina was his sex life, but because she was brave enough to ask, he forced himself to be honest. It's hard not to. There are a lot of willing women. But it got old for me pretty quickly. Believe it or not, I'm often relieved when my parents are on tour with us. Gives me an excuse to bow out of the nightlife and just hang with them. It's nice, she said wistfully, turning to face him again. The relationship you have with them. What about your parents? He hesitated, then asked the question he never thought he would. Would you ever want to join them on the road? They wouldn't want me to. He jerked in surprise. You can't be serious. Your parents have always adored you. How can you say that? Oh, I didn't mean that the way it sounded. Outwardly, they'd welcome me. But really, I'd be a third wheel. I know they love me, but there's a bond between them. They wouldn't want me around. Seriously? It was only after I was grown and out of the house that my parents started traveling. Maybe that's when they truly felt they could be a couple. So I try not to intrude. Plus, I don't enjoy traveling all that much. It takes me away from work, and I like having a home base. More proof that he wasn't the right man for Melina. He didn't have a home base. Didn't even know what having one would feel like anymore. He was tempted to ask her how much traveling she'd done. As far as he knew, she hadn't done much, and he'd always assumed that had been her choice. Now he wasn't so sure. Now he wondered if it was just that she hadn't wanted to travel alone. But it seemed to be a topic she didn't want to continue, and he wasn't sure he wanted to continue it either, given the melancholy look that had come across her face. Once you were on your own, I thought your mom might start acting again. Melina's mother had been an up-and-coming actress right around the time she'd met Melina's father. Years ago, he'd rented one of her movies, amazed at how animated she'd been. Whenever he'd seen her as a kid, she'd been friendly but quiet, serious. Far from the chirpy, flirty girl on the screen. Although she hadn't been as quiet or serious as a child, Melina had slowly adopted those traits as she'd grown up, and he'd felt more and more separated from her. He now wondered which of her mother's personas had been real versus an act. He already knew that Melina's quiet exterior hid something amazingly passionate, but that was a new discovery made only last night. No, she gave that world up a long time ago. She loved my father that much. Rhys wasn't sure why giving up her acting dreams was part and parcel of being with Melina's father, but he had to admit they were a good pairing. It was, in fact, hard to believe that Susan, Melina's mother, had ever been in show business. She'd adapted to academic life as if she'd been born to it. Their relationship had been completely different than Rhys's parents because there hadn't seemed to be a lot of volatility to it. Melina's parents always worked together in sync, similar personalities that managed to converge into one unit. For the first time, he wondered exactly how it would feel to be the outsider in that relationship, when a daughter shouldn't ever be made to feel like an outsider. But that was clearly how Melina felt. So these willing women, how do they let their willingness be known? Something close to panic shot through him. I don't think we should really talk about that. Why not? Frustration made him clench his teeth, but he slowly relaxed his jaw. It's usually a note passed to us by an usher. Sometimes they'll wait around until we're leaving the theater. One time. He cleared his throat, then forced himself to be honest. One woman actually found out where we were staying and walked up while I was having dinner. She, made it pretty clear she wasn't wearing anything under her trench coat. Then she said she had a message for me, drawn on her body with lipstick. Silence filled the car for several minutes, and he struggled for something to say. He should have kept that last one to himself. So why don't we... Well, the lipstick was certainly overt, but that's what guys like, right? Did it work? Without taking his eyes off the road, he answered quietly, "Yes, but that was a long time ago, when I was still reeling from the attention. Was it something explicit?" Sighing, he shrugged. "Let's just say it involved an arrow and 2 short words." Her eyes widened and she blushed. "Did you do what it said?" she whispered. "No." Why not? How could he explain that he simply hadn't wanted to? That he never did unless he knew the woman well, cared about her. Honestly, that entire night's pretty much a big blur now. One big red blur of Shanghai crimson. Revlon, I believe. Holding his breath, he kept his gaze on the road. She was silent for so long he finally turned and looked at her. Her face was blank of emotion, and he expected her to launch into a lecture. Instead, she burst out laughing. Relieved, he reached out to caress her leg and stroked her in a soft, soothing motion. "Like I said, that was a long time ago, Melina. I'm much more discerning about who I'm with now." Her expression grew serious. "Unless it's an old friend who's sneaked into your hotel room. Especially when it's an old friend who sneaked into my hotel room. You don't have to." He squeezed her knee warningly. "I'm serious." She shrugged. "Sure, whatever." Turning back to the window, she clearly communicated that their conversation was over. He let her shut him out for a bit, but he kept his hand on her leg, reminding her with his touch that he wasn't going anywhere. About 30 minutes later, he caught the yawn she tried to stifle. "We're going on a bit of a drive. Why don't you go ahead and go to sleep?" She shook her head. "I can keep you company." "You will be keeping me company. Besides, you're going to need your rest." "What are we going to do?" He shot her a wicked grin. "Patience, baby. I'll reveal the class outline when we get to where we're going." She narrowed her eyes at him. "Are you trying to be funny?" He slid his hand just a fraction higher on her leg, and she gasped. Just as he'd hoped, she reached out and grabbed his hand with her own. Satisfied, he tightened his hold on hers, resting their linked hands on her knee. "Just rest, I promise. You'll know everything in just a couple of hours." He brought her hand up to his mouth to kiss it. "Now go to sleep, Ladybug." Leaning her head back, she stared at him while he focused on the road. He felt her looking at him and rubbed his thumb in slow, circular movements against the back of her hand. Within minutes, he felt her begin to relax. Within 10, she'd closed her eyes. And within 20, her soft, steady breathing told him she'd gone to sleep. Gently, he brought their raised hands back to his lips for another soft kiss. When Melina awoke, she was in the passenger seat of her car, and she was alone. Jolting up, she frantically searched for Rhys and immediately saw him standing at the front of the car talking to a bearded man in a baseball cap. Pulling down the visor, she checked herself in the mirror, wincing at the sight that looked back at her. Her glasses were askew, her hair limp, no makeup on her face. But the men had turned toward her, and Rhys was motioning her outside, and she'd feel like an absolute fool if she didn't go out and greet them. So she straightened her glasses, took a deep breath, and opened the car. "Melina, this is my friend Rod. He owns the Holiday Harbor store." Rhys gestured to the weathered 2-story building behind them. Beyond it, a long dock floated over a peaceful lake surrounded by tall redwood trees. "Rod, this is Melina." She held out her hand. "A pleasure to meet you." "The pleasure's all mine." Ignoring her proffered hand, Rod pulled her in for a deep bear hug. "It's great to finally meet you. I've heard a lot about you from the Dalton family over the years." Flushed with pleasure, Melina smoothed back her hair. That's nice." She peeked up at Rhys, and he tucked his hand around her waist and pulled her closer. At first she held herself slightly apart from him as he continued to talk to Rod, but then she relaxed, allowing herself to sink into him. He looked down and smiled at her in approval. "Rod checks in on the place when I'm not around." I was just getting the lowdown on the lake. The water's been pretty low this year, but last month's rain has got it back up to boating levels. Rod's got a patio boat he lets me use when I'm here. Where is here? Lake Shasta, about 30 minutes north of Redding. I didn't realize you had a place here. It's something I bought a few years back. Oh, her implication was clear from her tone. They hadn't talked enough in the last few years for her to know much of anything about him. But she was surprised Max hadn't said anything about it. Do you own it with Max? Rhys tensed for a moment. Nope, this is something that I did completely on my own. Max has come up a few times, but he gets a little antsy when he's here. He's not much for roughing it. Somehow I can't see you roughing it much either. Rod chuckled. She's got your number, Rhys, but he does surprisingly well while he's here. He's got some good survival skills. Not that you'll be needing them much. Rhys's house is great. It just took him a while to get it in habitable shape. Rhys remodeled a house? He obviously had more skill with his hands than she'd thought. Flushing at her thought, she blurted, Is there a restroom here I can use? Use the one in the restaurant. It's nicer than the open restroom by the lake. She nodded. Thank you. She rushed into the building, acutely aware of the men's gazes on her. She walked through a little store on the way to the restaurant bathroom, noting the souvenirs and water products for sale. When she was done, she retraced her steps, stopping when a rack of bathing suits caught her eye. Biting her lip, she stared at a white halter-top bikini that was prominently displayed. If they were going to be staying here a few days and Rhys wanted to go swimming, she'd need something, wouldn't she? She could just see him trying to persuade her to go skinny dipping, and she wasn't sure she could actually go through with that. Still, she flipped through the suits on the rack. There were several one-pieces that looked just like the one she had at home. Modest, flattering, but her eyes kept straying to the white two-piece. Before she could change her mind, she picked it up. Would you like to keep the hanger? The cheerful teenager behind the register asked. No, thanks. She handed the girl two $20 bills. I love this suit. I wore it in black just the other day. Melina tensed. Of course the girl would wear a bikini. She was tall, slim, and had the curves to fill out the swimsuit the way it was meant to be. Melina tried to picture herself wearing the bikini while standing next to this girl's similarly dressed form. Her stomach clenched in horror. Her hand whipped out to grab the bikini back just as the girl held it out. Here you go. Have a great day. Melina stared at the skimpy swatches of fabric, no longer sure the bottom half would cover all that needed to be covered. You know, I didn't know you had this in black. I think I should wait until you get that in. The girl frowned. Oh, I'm sorry, but the bathing suits aren't returnable. Sure, but I just bought it, Melina explained with a bright smile. It's not like I went out and wore it. Well, how about I just exchange it then? She grabbed a black one-piece from the rack. This'll do for now, and look, it's on sale, right? Well, yeah, but... Then I'll take it. You can even keep the difference. The girl looked nervously at the door that led outside. I don't know. I guess I could talk to Rod, explain you changed your mind. Why don't I go out and... No, Melina yelled in panic, causing the girl to jerk. I mean, I don't want to be a bother. I guess I'll take the white bikini after all. She stuffed the thing in her purse and headed for the door. Thanks, she called. Before she could change her mind, she rushed back to where Rhys and Rod were still talking. What had she been thinking? She'd never worn a bikini in her life, let alone a white one. She couldn't even wear white pants without it looking like her hips had expanded by several inches. The one piece would have been safer. But, she reminded herself, that would also have been so predictable of her. Give yourself some props for bravery, she urged herself. Your store and restaurant are very nice, she said a bit breathlessly to Rod. We'll definitely have to come back sometime. I'd like that. Rod beamed at them. Inside, Melina was aghast. Had she just implied that she and Rhys would be back sometime in the future? Together? As in a regular couple? She opened her mouth to correct her mistake, but Rhys put an arm around her shoulders and squeezed. Once more, his expression radiated approval, which confused her, even as it made her heart fill with joy. It was a pleasure meeting you, Melina. You take care of your man here, you hear? Rhys actually seemed to blush. The thought that he might be a little thrown by what was happening between them calmed her nerves. So what if she'd never worn a white bikini? Who cared if she never wore the one she'd just bought? She could pretend she was the type of woman who would wear it, right? Doing just that, she lowered her lids and tried to put her breathlessness to work. "Oh, I definitely will take care of him," she murmured. Both Rod and Rhys looked poleaxed, and an enticing ripple of power thrummed through her. Suppressing a smile, she turned and walked back to the car, putting a little extra swing into her hips. She climbed into the car and patted her large purse. She'd almost panicked back there, but buying the stupid bikini had changed her. It was like a sexy little secret that only she knew about. Even if all she did was act like the type of woman who would wear the thing, no one would be the wiser. And it would be worth it to see that look on Rhys's face again, a combination of surprise and approval mixed with a whole lot of desire. When Rhys got back behind the wheel, he smiled. "Ready to go?" She placed her hand high on his thigh and squeezed. He gasped, stared at her hand, then looked up at her. She kept her eyes wide and innocent. "I'm ready for anything. The question is, are you?" With a deep breath and a slightly dazed expression, he started the car and pulled back onto the road. Melina leaned back in her seat and smiled. No one could ever accuse her of being anything other than a fast learner. Rhys tried telling himself he was being ridiculous. He'd never brought a woman here, true, but it wasn't like he was trying to impress Melina with the house. There was nothing grand about it. It wasn't even on the lake, although the water was just a few short minutes' drive away. The house was pre-manufactured, but it had been in such sorry shape that Rhys had had to rebuild about a third of it. Given his touring schedule, he didn't have all that much time to devote to it, but when he did, he worked with utter devotion. He loved puttering around this place. It was as much of a home base as he'd had since he was a kid. He just didn't get here nearly often enough. And while he sometimes called on Max or Rod to help him out with a job or two, for the most part, he enjoyed being by himself. Today, however, he'd felt compelled to show it to Melina. Like it or not, he was nervous to see what her reaction would be. He needn't have worried. "Oh, Rhys," she breathed when she caught sight of the little house on an elevated lot at the end of a dirt driveway. "It's wonderful." She got out of the car and turned slowly in a circle, taking in the view of redwood trees and hills. What a beautiful setting. He could tell she loved it. The wonder on her face was genuine and closely mirrored the way he'd felt when he'd first seen the land. "Thanks. I like it." "How did you find it?" "Rod and I have been friends for a while, ever since Max and I rented a houseboat on the lake years ago. I mentioned that I wouldn't mind having some vacation property up here, and he gave me a call when this lot became available." She graced him with a broad, carefree smile that made his breath catch. "Will you show me around?" He laughed. "There's not much to see, but sure, I'll give you the grand tour." About 30 minutes later, he rubbed his palms together. "So let's go for a picnic by the lake, take a swim." She frowned. "But what will I do for a swimsuit?" A grin split his face. He'd liked the underwear she'd worn last night. He was hoping she had another set just like it. "I think we can come up with something." She hesitated, then lifted her chin. "Okay, that would be nice." She moved toward the guest bedroom, stopping when Rhys called out, "We'll be sharing the master bedroom, Melina." She blinked and blushed. "Oh, sure." Changing course, she stepped into the master bedroom and shut the door. When the bedroom door opened, Melina came out wearing baggy sweat shorts and an oversized tee. "I'm ready," she said softly, sounding far less sure of herself than she had when she'd placed her hand on his thigh. Once he'd gotten over the shock, he'd recognized the satisfaction his response had given her. Melina definitely liked a challenge, and he was about to give her the biggest one so far. "Great, I'll be right back." He went into the bedroom and swiftly changed into shorts and an open button-down shirt. When he walked out, Melina smiled and turned toward the front door. "Wait," he called out. "There's something I need to do first." "What's that?" He gently clasped her arms, and she tilted her head back, her eyes wide, her lips parting slightly. "I need to give you your first pop quiz." Chapter 7. Dalton's Magic Rule Number 8. Encourage active participation. The idea of a pop quiz obviously wasn't something that turned Melina on. She pulled away from him and crossed her arms over her chest, her eyes immediately reflecting her discomfort. I'm not really big on pop quizzes. Amusement tipped up one corner of his mouth. No, she wouldn't be. Melina liked to prepare, research, have the answers in hand so she could control the situation. Lucky for her, he was here to nudge her out of her comfort zone. There's no wrong answer to the question I'm about to ask. Then it's not really a pop quiz. A quiz implies by its very nature that there's a right answer or a wrong answer. A huge grin split his face now. What about multiple choice questions? Haven't you ever answered a question with D, all of the above? Well, sure, she began hesitantly, but... There is no but, he said softly. Not in this scenario. Looking like she wanted to argue some more, she simply shrugged and said, Fine, there are no wrong answers. Good. The other thing about this question is that you don't answer it right away. You just think about it. And you answer when you're ready. So what's the question? The key to flirting is, what would you do to have me? She stared at him blankly. Excuse me? That's the question for you to think about. What would you do to have me? I'm not sure I understand the question. Why don't you just tell me what you want, and I'll let you know if it's something I'm not comfortable with? His expression grew serious. And is that where your willingness to learn ends, with the obvious answer? She reacted just as he expected she would. Challenge Melina's thirst for knowledge and complexity, and expect her to sit quietly and take it? No way. Hands on hips, she thrust her chin out. Just what are you getting at, Rhys? You know as well as I do that sometimes the key to learning is figuring things out for yourself. Why wouldn't that apply in this situation as well? She came very close to pouting. Seems to me this is a trick question. He laughed. It can't be, because the answer is what it is. If you're willing to do what I ask and nothing more, then that's the answer. You're talking in circles, she cried. I don't want to guess what I need to do. I want to know. That's the whole reason I asked Max for help. I don't want to play the game just to fail again. His heart skipped as he saw the real distress in her eyes. Baby, you're not going to fail. There's no way that's possible. She just shook her head, biting her lip until he wanted to take her in his arms and hold her close. So that's what he did. He pulled her in for a hug and rocked her. She let him hug her, but didn't return the favor. Soon she pulled away. I'm sorry, I obviously can't even do this right. I think I should just leave. Is that what you really want? He asked quietly to mask his own desperation. To quit before we even get started? No, but I don't understand why you're making this so complicated. Because despite what you obviously think, men are complicated. It's about you figuring it out. Reading the signs, learning to trust your instincts. Flirting even though it makes you uncomfortable. She looked unconvinced. Hell, she practically rolled her eyes. She was obviously going to need more convincing before she'd willingly agree to his lesson plan. Okay, so let's go back to our conversation in the car. You said men wanted overt. An arrow painted with red lipstick falls into that category, right? She frowned, obviously not happy with thinking about that little message again. Well, things aren't always so black and white, even when the shade is Shanghai crimson. When you say men like the overt, you're oversimplifying. Really, and how's that? What that woman did, it was a turn-on because she went for it. It could have been Max or any other successful magician, but she was going to get what she desperately wanted, one way or another. Have you ever wanted anything like that, Melina? Because, believe me, I have. And I never thought I had a chance in hell of getting it. Not until I walked into my hotel room last night and found you waiting for me. She was breathing hard, her eyes wide and dazed, staring at him as if she'd never seen him before. And she hadn't. Not really. He'd never let her see the passion he harbored for her, not so clear and out in the open. But he was letting her see it now, if she bothered to look. This weekend is about experimenting, learning each other's likes and dislikes. But it's also about pushing each other to our limits, finding out what drives us. How far you'll go to have me. Not by me showing or telling you, by being motivated to figure it out on your own. And you think you can motivate me?" Saying nothing, he shot her a wicked grin. That's all it took to have her blushing. To her credit, however, she didn't go down without a fight. "So let me get this right. You're going to make me figure it out on my own?" "I promise to give you lots of feedback. But what I like might not be what another man does. Doing it this way strengthens not only your confidence, but your instincts too. Or it just makes me look like a fool again, and probably leads to a lot of frustration for you. If you're willing to take the chance, I think I'll be able to stand it." She pursed her lips, thinking about it. "I don't know, Rhys, maybe this just isn't—" "What do you say we compromise?" She took a step back, clearly not trusting him. "How?" "I'll agree to tell you what I like, what most men like. But each time I do, you need to try something on your own." "And what if I do something you don't like?" "Then you win and you won't have to do it again." "You're that sure of your theory?" "I'm that sure of you. It's a win-win situation for me, isn't it? You try something I like, it pleases me. You try something I don't like, we're back to me telling you what I like, right?" She squinted as if trying to make sense of his convoluted reasoning. "I guess." "Good. Now we should probably get going if we want to get in the water before it's cold." He handed her a basket with a blanket and paper goods. "What do you say we play a game on the drive there?" "A game?" "Yes, that's something most guys like too. Teasing. Playing with their partner. Last night I pushed you a little to talk to me, to tell me what you like. You ever play the alphabet game?" She followed him out to the car. "I'm familiar with it." "Good, then let's start with that." At the car, he opened the driver's side door and turned to her with one raised brow. "Can you talk flirty to me? Tell me some of your favorite flirty words. And just for kicks, why don't you alphabetize them for me?" Melina didn't know why, but something about Rhys's request rankled her. She got into the passenger seat and slammed the door shut. As Rhys started the engine and pulled out of the driveway, she glared at him. "You don't think I'll do it, do you?" "Why would I think that? You're very good at following instructions." She felt her temper spike, still not sure why she was so riled. All she knew was that he seemed too calm and controlled for her liking, especially since she felt anything but. "If there's one thing I'm good at, it's words." "Why are you mad?" She stared out the windshield and crossed her arms over her chest. I don't know. Maybe because this seems to be one big joke to you." He braked so suddenly that she jerked forward against her seatbelt. Bracing one hand on the wheel and the other on the headrest behind her, he glared at her. "Tell me one thing I've done to make you think this is a joke to me." "It's obvious, isn't it? You're trying to make me feel uncomfortable by drawing things out, poking fun at my intellectual side." "I'm not poking fun. I love your intellectual side. If you don't like my methods, I can drive you back home. I'm sure you can get Max to meet you with one phone call." With that, he shifted in his seat until he again faced forward. She pressed her lips together, trying not to cry. "I'm sorry, I don't know what's wrong with me, and I don't want to call Max. I want you," she thought. "It's always been you." He sighed and started driving again. "There's nothing wrong with you, you're just feeling out of your element. But at some point, for us to go forward, you're going to need to trust me. Trust that I want only the best for you." She laughed humorously. "So it's my Sweet 16 all over again. You call the shots and I just wait for you to make your move. Is Trisha James going to make a surprise entrance too?" His jaw tightened. "If you want to discuss that night, we can. Frankly, I don't think you're ready to hear what I have to say." No doubt about it, his words spiked her curiosity. What could he say besides he was sorry? She bowed her head. "No, let's not go there, and I do trust you, Rhys. With me, I trust you." He said nothing. The mood in the car had grown so serious, and she had only herself to blame. Her one chance to be with Rhys, and what had she done? She'd blown it. Thinking fast, she blurted out, "Afterglow." "Excuse me?" "That's my first word, in alphabetical order. Afterglow." He turned to her, his mouth tilted up in amusement crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Nice." She breathed a sigh of relief. Maybe she could salvage things after all. She uncrossed her arms and shifted closer toward him. She swayed slightly with the gentle vibrations of the car and placed a hand on the dash to steady herself. Leaning forward, she brushed his ear with her lips and breathed her word. He hissed in a breath. When she reached out to put her hand on his thigh, his hand whipped out, grabbing her wrist. "Don't," he croaked out, his voice guttural. "Or what?" she whispered. "Or we're never going to make it into the water, and I, for one, can use some cooling down." He stopped the car and she looked around. They'd reached the lake. "Darn, I was just getting started. It feels good, doesn't it?" She drew back and he slowly released her. "What?" "Knowing that just the sound of your voice pleases me." "It really does, doesn't it?" she asked, a feeling of wonder making her grin. "Rein yourself in there, Ladybug. There's only so much a guy can take before he cracks." "What's your cracking point?" she pouted. "That's for me to know and me to find out." He winked and threw open his car door. "Come on, I've worked up an appetite." Grabbing the basket with a blanket, he walked to a shaded spot by the lake. She was still reeling with satisfaction while she unpacked their food. That feeling went out the window 5 minutes later when Rhys stripped off his shirt. Smooth, tanned skin, defined muscles, and a rippling six-pack nearly mesmerized her. "What do you want first?" he asked, gesturing to the spread of crusty bread, Gouda cheese, grapes, and prosciutto. She shook her head. "I'm not that hungry, actually." "I'll be quick." He reached for a grape. Before she knew what she was doing, she laid her hand over his, stopping him. She was breathing rapidly, her heart hammering in her ears. "It's my turn, right?" His green eyes darkened. "What do you have in mind?" Would you lean closer?" Obediently, he did. She took hold of one plump grape and lifted it. When he opened his mouth, she placed the grape on his tongue. He chewed the juicy fruit slowly, then swallowed. Do you want another one?" "Please." She took another grape and fed it to him. He staggered to his feet. "Rhys," she whispered. "You're one dangerous lady." "So you like me feeding you?" "What do you think?" She swallowed hard. "You liked it." "Yeah, that's an understatement." And with that, he backed away from her, eyes locked with hers until the last possible moment. Then he turned and cannonballed into the water, splashing her with a huge wave that made her yelp even as she laughed out loud. "Come on in, the water's great." Melina stood uncertainly at the edge of the water as Rhys motioned her closer. She wanted closer. There was only one problem. She was a coward. She'd been too much of a coward to wear the bikini, and she was too much of a coward to strip down to her bra and panties. Not white, but a pale peach that was so sheer it left nothing to the imagination. Maybe she squirmed at the thought because now Rhys was staring at her oddly. She needed to get in that water and fast. Taking a deep breath and raising her chin defiantly, she pulled her tea over her head. She heard Rhys's sharp inhalation for breath immediately. Before she could change her mind, she shoved down her shorts, kicked them off, and with a quick movement, she dived in after him. Under the relative safety of the water, Rhys tried to think of something, anything that would give him a modicum of control as he watched Melina start a lazy crawl toward him. When Melina squealed and giggled, then dived under the water to see what had brushed against her, he thought, this. He was waiting for this. The opportunity to play with her, learn about her, enjoy her. Once this weekend was over, he'd lose that chance. Melina was letting her guard down because she had an excuse, but once that excuse was gone, the awkwardness and shyness and differences would be back on her radar. In fact, they'd probably be worse. He'd be Rhys, Max's brother again. But he'd also be the guy who'd seen her vulnerable, and once she was back in her real world, Melina would remember that. He had to pack a lifetime of loving Melina in 2 short days. When she came back up for air, she was grinning. "You should have warned me we had company." He shrugged. "You're a nature girl. Fish, bugs, what's the difference?" She sniffed. "Surely you jest. Insects are higher on the evolutionary chain than fish, you know." His eyebrows shot up. "Really?" He knew a few random facts about insects simply because Melina would occasionally throw them into conversation. He'd even done some independent research because learning more about bugs was one pathetic step closer to learning more about Melina. This, however, he'd never heard before. She floated on her back, closing her eyes, a contented smile on her lips that made him think of the expression she'd worn when she'd said his name and fallen asleep in his arms. He paddled closer. And what do you base that theory on, Darwin or Genesis? She yawned. Both, actually. But you don't want to hear about that. Silently, he caught her by the waist and swung her around to face him. Right now, I want to hear whatever you want to tell me. She leaned back and her mouth opened, but then she hesitated. They stared at one another, so close he could see the golden flecks in her warm eyes. Cream and syrup, he thought, leaning down to plant a soft kiss on her shoulder. You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, Ladybug. She bit her lip, but just as he leaned down to kiss her, she forced out a laugh, shook her head, and pushed away, looking back at him from over her shoulder. According to creationism, fish were created on day 5, insects on day 6, along with man and woman. For evolutionists, life originates in primeval oceans. It's one of the few things the two can agree on. Fish first, insects after. I'll be sure to remember that little fact. Come here. He reached for her, but she swam away again, prompting him to growl in frustration. She'd never teased this way with him. Max, yes. He'd watched her and his brother flirt and touch each other with affection while he did nothing but stand apart, wishing things were different. He liked her teasing far more than he'd ever thought possible. I find it interesting, the theory that man and insects were created on the same day. Just like men, male insects are quite willing to perform certain mating rituals in order to get what they want from a female. Eyes narrowing, he got the distinct feeling she was trying to rebuild a wall between them. He swam closer, and sure enough, she paddled backward. What had he done to scare her? Testing her, he treaded water but let himself float imperceptibly closer. You make it sound so calculated. Women, and I'm assuming female bugs, have their agenda, their needs, too. Tell that to the female bedbug. When she lets a male get close to her, it pierces her body cavity with its penis to deposit sperm. Seems pretty calculated to me. He frowned. What are you saying, Melina? You're afraid I'm gonna hurt you? Male insects don't exactly have it easy, Everyone knows what happens to a male praying mantis when he mates. Confusion swept over her expression, making her look like the little girl he'd met when her parents had first come to help his parents. Again, she seemed to force out a little laugh. The female only occasionally bites off his head. Only when it's well-deserved, I'm sure. She shook her head, her expression growing somber. Seriously, of course I don't think you're gonna hurt me. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I know how things go. The flowers, the chocolates, deep conversations that a man puts out when he's interested in a woman. It's all part of the mating ritual. A man puts forth great effort to catch a woman's attention so he can get what he wants. Not liking what he was hearing, he circled her like a shark, noting the increased color in her cheeks and the rapidness of her breaths. I'm still not getting your point. My point is, you don't need to do it. The teasing, the picnic, the compliments. She waved the air, separating them. The little lessons on trust and submission, all this. I don't need to be wooed, Rhys. I'll give you what you want. I'll give you anything you want this weekend. Her message was implied but clear. This weekend, but not longer. He lunged for her and she squealed, barely managing to elude his grasp this time. Despite the slow build of anger inside him, he tried grinning wolfishly. I'm the teacher here, remember, baby? Or have you decided there's a thing or two you can teach me? Chapter 8. Dalton's Magic Rule Number 9. Tie someone up and use a little mood music. Come here, Melina. The way he said it, with more than a hint of a dare, made her heart leap out of control. To counter it, she cocked a brow, but she didn't move any closer to him. Why? In response, he glided slowly toward her until they were treading water next to each other, his legs occasionally bumping into hers. Reaching out, he cupped her cheek, soothing his thumb across her brow in a tender gesture, because I'm gonna kiss you again, and again, and again. He kissed her ear and worked his way down to her shoulder, continuing the kisses as he repeated the words over and over and again. For the rest of the evening, again and more became Rhys's personal mantra. Melina engraved the words in her memory, cherishing them but also taking them as a challenge. They took a break for dinner, munching on some of the savories that Rhys had packed for lunch before he started a fire. Now they sat on the couch, Melina practically in his lap and Rhys playing with her hair. Enveloped in a soft blanket, she stared at the fire, wondering what part of the day would become her favorite once the weekend was over. "You went somewhere," he said. "What's wrong?" She jolted, stunned that he would pick up on her change of mood so quickly. Forcing herself to smile, she shook her head. He pulled her back into his arms so that her back rested against his chest and his chin nudged the top of her head. He took in a deep breath. "You still use the shampoo your mom made for you." I guess I'm just a creature of habit." She peered up at him. "Although you're certainly changing that." "I haven't changed anything," he said seriously. "You're still the same person you were. You're just giving yourself permission to be who you really are." Well, one thing's for sure. I never thought I'd get here." "Here?" "In one of the Dalton twins' arms," she clarified in a panic. Rhys stiffened. She cringed. Holy moly. Had she actually said that? Not only did she almost reveal how she felt about Rhys, but she'd pretty much implied he and Max were interchangeable. Remembering what he'd said about the woman in the trench coat and lipstick wanting him for his stage persona rather than himself, she shook her head and wrenched around to face him. Rhys released her and stood. The frown on his face confirmed that he'd taken her words in the worst way possible. "So you were thinking of me or Max the whole time?" he said. "Rhys, I'm sorry, that's not—" "Maybe you switched back and forth depending on what we were doing?" For the first time, she saw disgust in his eyes. She reached out, cringing when he pulled away. "That's not what I meant, Rhys. Honest, please don't think that." "I don't know why I'm surprised," he said. Raking his hands through his hair, he laughed, a bitter, rancorous sound. "You've always preferred Max's company to mine. Need a favor. Call Max, and heck, if he can't do it, there's always Rhys." Feeling like she was suddenly traversing a minefield, Melina said, "No, that's not—" Rhys snorted. "No? Come on, Melina, you just said it yourself. Either one of us would have done the trick. Apparently nothing's changed in 12 years. He turned away, stalking toward his bedroom. Stunned, Melina stared at his broad back, unable to believe he'd thrown that night 12 years ago in her face. You big jerk," she cried. Rhys froze and slowly turned toward her. "You big jerk," he taunted. "Come on, Melina, you can do better than that. You're a master with words, right?" "Stop," she whispered, torn apart by the nastiness in his tone. He took hold of her arms, then released them, his touch hovering as if he wanted to shake her but was fighting not to. "Why are you so angry?" she said. "I know what I said sounded bad, but you know I've always loved you." "You know what? I don't need that kind of love. At least the women who want me for my fame are honest about their motives. You had to pull the pity card." She jerked, too shocked to form a comeback. By the look on his face, he'd managed to stun himself. He reached out for her. "I'm sorry, Melina, I didn't mean—" She shoved him away with both hands, managing to knock him back a step. Blinded by tears, she whirled around and tried to run, but her legs got caught up in the blanket and she tripped, falling to the floor. Stunned more than hurt, she flopped around, trying to free her arms and legs so she could get away. He crouched down next to her, trying to help her. She slapped his hands away. "Don't touch me," she screamed. "I'm sorry I said that, Melina. I'm sorry I blew up at all. Will you please listen to me, please?" Since he was crowding her and she was shaking so hard that she couldn't get to her feet, she sat up and wrapped her arms around her knees, squeezing them to her chest. In the back of her mind, she remembered she'd started all this with her poor choice of words. Somehow, however, his anger and hostility, something she'd never faced before, wouldn't allow her to soften. "Fine, but the moment you're done, I'm leaving." She'd known if she ever let herself believe in him that things would end badly. And now she had to live the rest of her life knowing exactly what she was missing. "Okay, If that's what you want, I'll drive you back." "I'll drive myself back," she snapped. "You can figure out how to get to wherever you're going next on your own." "Okay." He held out his hands. "Okay, fine." Slowly, he lowered himself to the floor, sitting in front of her. He dipped his head, trying to get her to look at him. "First, I apologize for what I said. I swore I'd never deliberately hurt you, and I did. Will you accept my apology?" Still refusing to look at him, she shrugged, refusing to say more. "What you said about wanting to be with a Dalton twin had obviously pressed a big button of mine." She traced the grain on a plank of hardwood. "I didn't mean it the way it sounded," she said grudgingly. "Okay, but you can see how I mistook your meaning, can't you? And why it might bother me that you just saw me as a substitute for my brother?" Forcing herself to look up, she nodded. "Yes, I can see that, and I tried to apologize right away and explain." "I know you did. I accept your apology. Will you explain now?" She saw the genuine regret on his face and felt it herself. She hated the idea of hurting Rhys or of him being mad at her, but she couldn't cave either. Not without some sort of explanation. "First, I want to know what you meant about me not having changed in 12 years. He hesitated briefly. "I meant the way you kissed Max in the gazebo when I'd asked you to meet me there. I know it was a one-time thing, but I've always viewed that as you exchanging one Dalton twin for the other." Amazed, she straightened. "And how do you think I felt about Trisha? There I was waiting for you for over an hour, thinking you were going to finally... And you were making out with her the whole time. I didn't exchange Max for you. He was just trying to make me feel better. That's why he kissed me. And I'm sorry if that bothers you, but given what you'd done, I don't think you have a right to point fingers at anyone." Confusion creased Rhys's forehead. "What do you mean I was making out with Trisha the whole time? I never made out with her." Abruptly hiking the blanket to her thighs, Melina jumped to her feet. "Why are you lying?" Getting to his feet more slowly, Rhys strode past her and into his bedroom. She watched him in disbelief. "Where are you?" Before she could finish the question, he was back, pulling on a pair of shorts with stiff, jerky movements. "Did Max tell you I was making out with Trisha?" She hugged her arms to her chest, not knowing what to think. "Yes, are you telling me you weren't?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you." She pulled the blanket tighter around her. "But why would Max lie?" "I've got a pretty good idea." Rhys threw his hands in the air and began pacing. "No wonder he felt so bad afterward, telling me it was nothing, that he'd initiated it, that I shouldn't let it stop me from telling you how I feel." Coming to a stop, he pointed his finger at her for emphasis. "I sent Max to tell you why I was late. I caught Trisha throwing up in the bathroom. Caught her making herself throw up. You know how obsessed she was with staying thin? Well, she freaked when I caught her. Thought I would tell her parents, and I sat down with her, telling her that's exactly what she should do. When she'd calmed down and finally agreed, I was walking her out when I saw you kissing Max. Then you just left. When I tried to talk to you... Shaking, Melina lowered herself to the couch. "I froze you out. I was so crushed I didn't want to talk to you, never wanted to talk about that night." Rhys dropped down next to her, his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor between his feet. "You had something you wanted to tell me that night. What was it?" Rhys pressed his lips together. "I was going to ask you out." It was what she'd hoped, but to hear him verify it after all these years was almost too good to be true. "Out? A slow smile curved Rhys's lips. "Yes, out. So you liked me? Melina knew she sounded like an idiot, but the way things were going, she wanted things to be crystal clear. "Yes," Rhys said simply. "I liked you too. I still do," she whispered. Reaching out, he took her hand and squeezed. Like me? She laughed, yes. "Do you still like me enough to give me a hug?" She practically leapt into his arms, knocking him over so he fell back with her on top of him. Their mouths met for several long, deep kisses before she pulled back. "I want to ask you something," she confessed, "but I'm afraid you'll get mad again." He hugged her closer. "I might, but I promise to stay calm and let you say what you need to." Reaching out, she traced his lips with a finger. Teasingly, he caught the tip of her finger with his teeth, making her giggle. Since the topic was obviously so important to him, however, she forced herself to be serious. "Do you really think people view you and Max as interchangeable? Anyone who knows you sees the differences between you." Smoothing his hands up and down her back, he said, "Yeah? And what differences do you see?" "Max is less certain of himself, and he disguises it by acting cocky. It's why he sleeps with so many women and why he jokes around so much. You're more introspective, more serious. You put the weight of the world on your shoulders because you care about people so much. Like what you told me about Trisha, you interrupted your own plans to talk with her. Max wouldn't have. Not that Max doesn't care, but he wouldn't have felt comfortable getting that close to someone's scars. He'd have helped her, but by grabbing one of us or your mother to talk to her." For a moment, Rhys couldn't respond. He was so choked up by how she saw him that he almost wanted to duck his head and hide for fear she'd see just how much. Max was more comfortable with people, but she was right. It was mostly on a superficial level. Rhys, their parents, Melina, they were the only ones Max had ever really trusted enough to let inside. Rhys's circle wasn't that much bigger, so he knew Melina was exaggerating to a degree. He still liked how she saw him. "There's another difference between you, but I'm not sure if I should tell you. It might give you a big head," she whispered. He grinned. "Too late for that." She stretched up so she could whisper in his ear, "You promise you won't tell anyone?" "I promise." Raising herself up slightly, Melina looked directly into Rhys's eyes. "You're way better looking than Max," she deadpanned. "You little—" Digging his fingers into Melina's sides, he tickled her, making her screech and laugh with delight even as she struggled to get away. He ceased tickling her almost immediately and instead wrapped his arms around her, hugging her tight. The last thing he wanted, he realized, was for her to get away. Chapter 9. Dalton's Magic Rule Number 10. Know when to move on. The next morning, Melina woke to a curious swishing sound. Stretched out on her stomach and nestled under Rhys's down comforter, she patted the bed next to her, confirming that Rhys was no longer with her. Blinking her eyes open, she yawned and stretched, hissing at the soreness in long-neglected muscles even as she grinned. Rolling slowly onto her back, she stared at the ceiling, straining her ears to identify the sound that continued to drift through the closed bedroom door. A flash of white caught her eye, and she bolted into a sitting position, then fumbled for her glasses on the nightstand. After jamming them on her face, she stared at the white pieces of fabric slung over the doorknob. It was the bikini she'd bought, the one she'd taken out of her purse and then chickened out of wearing. She'd stuffed it into her overnight bag before they'd left for the lake, only Rhys had obviously found it. Her first reaction was embarrassment. Sure, he'd said she was a bikini girl, but something this flashy and risque? Something so out of character for her? Standing, she moved toward the door and picked up the bikini, grimacing at the little piece of string that was supposed to not cover her bottom. Swoosh, swoosh, the strange sound was a bit louder now that she was so close to the door. Whatever he was doing out there, she tried to imagine his reaction if she sauntered out wearing nothing but the bikini. She quickly pulled on the bottom piece, then looked down at herself. She could see the first sign of stubble on her calves, and she knew from behind she had a dimple or 2 or 10 that she wouldn't be able to hide. She bit her lip, undecided. This was her last day with Rhys. She wanted to make the most of it. Did she really want to wear something she felt less than confident in? Shaking her head, she quickly pulled off the bottom, returned the pieces to her overnight bag, and then rushed into the bathroom to brush her teeth and dress. Compromising, she pulled on the shorts and pretty lavender tank top she'd bought for the weekend. It showed more skin than she normally did, so she didn't quite feel as cowardly as she did about the bikini. She opened the door, then froze, sucking in her breath at the sight in front of her. Rhys stood in the living room with the front door open. He was wearing jeans, but nothing else. Sunlight illuminated his bare chest and muscular arms as he rhythmically worked sandpaper across some kind of wooden frame. A light layer of sweat covered him, and he paused to swipe at his forehead, then down some water from a bottle. Staring at his throat as he chugged the water, Melina licked her lips and automatically stepped forward, wanting to wrap her arms around him and get all sweaty herself. He glanced up and saw her, his smile making her knees tremble. He put down the water bottle.
"Hey."
"Hey," she said back, moving closer. His eyes swept down her body.
"Very sexy, but it's not a bikini."
His exaggerated pout made her laugh. No.
"I hope you don't mind that I went through your bag. I threw your shorts and tee into the wash and figured I'd throw in anything else that needed to be washed, too."
"That was very thoughtful, thank you."
"You're welcome,"
he replied, looking amused. She peered at what he was working on. She'd been right, it was a frame with gentle curves, scrolled corbels, and intricate beadwork. "Oh, Rhys, what a beautiful mantle!" Grinning, he swiped his hand across the top.
"Isn't it? Someone painted it, and I've been wanting to get to the grain underneath. Since you were sleeping, I thought I'd try to get some of it done before we leave."
His voice trailed off, and he frowned. Wishfully, she wondered if it was because he didn't like the idea of their weekend ending. Since he didn't say that, she just nodded, trying to tell herself the sudden tightness in her throat was a result of all the talking they'd done last night. Looking around, she grabbed a banana from the counter and backed toward the bedroom. "You can keep working on it. I have some stuff I need to read anyway. I'm presenting at a conference this week." Now it was her turn to frown. Hello, conference, Jamie. She hadn't thought of him once since being with Rhys. She certainly hadn't spared a thought, enthusiastic or otherwise, for their after-conference drink date. That was not so good. Despite Lucy's concerns, Melina genuinely liked Jamie. He was attractive, kind, deep. She'd been excited by the prospect of going out with him. Now all she saw, all she longed for, was Rhys. Now here he was in front of her, and all she could think about was how it was going to end.
"Melina, are you okay?"
She bit her lip, wanting to shout, "No, I am not okay." She'd never be okay. Not after this. "You know how I am with public speaking," she forced out. "I'm presenting a workshop with Jamie. It's a wonderful opportunity since I'll be just one of 3 on a panel. Jamie talked me into it, but I guess I'm still more nervous than I'd hoped."
"You'll do great."
He put down the sandpaper, walked around the mantel, then held out his arms.
"Can I have a morning kiss?"
She walked into his arms, squeezing him tightly and kissing him so eagerly that her teeth scraped against his. Obviously sensing her desperation, he pulled back, his brows furrowed. He smoothed a hand over her hair.
"Tell me what's wrong."
Nothing. She pulled away and jerked her thumb over her shoulder. "I'm just gonna grab my paperwork and read in the bedroom if you don't mind."
"Are you sure?"
"Yes, I really need to catch up." He looked like he wanted to argue, but simply said,
1 hour and then we can go into town. I'll buy you lunch and we can walk around."
The hesitation in his voice indicated he was thrown off balance by her strange mood, and she struggled to reassure him. The last thing she wanted was him feeling sorry for her when they went their separate ways. "That sounds perfect." Feeling like her face was going to crack because she was smiling so hard, she backed into the bedroom and gave him a cheery wave. Hesitantly, he waved back. She shut the door. Leaning her forehead against it, she tried telling herself that the weekend wasn't over yet. She had the whole day with him before he left for... She scrunched up her face. She didn't even know where he was going when he left her. With the thought came a wave of intense emotion. Dropping the banana on the floor, she covered her mouth with both hands in order to stifle the grief that tried to pour out of her. Turning, she stumbled, but she didn't even make it to the bed. Slowly, she sank to the floor and curled into a fetal position. She was splintering apart, she thought. No matter how tightly she squeezed her eyes shut, the tears leaked out, all the more painful for their silence. Rhys stared at the closed bedroom door, once more debating whether to follow Melina. He got within 2 feet of it, his hand raised to knock, before he turned away. Rubbing his hands over his face, he muttered a curse. Several curses. When he'd mentioned the end of the weekend, he thought he'd seen a flash of panic on Melina's face that echoed his own. But then she'd started talking about the conference, and he wasn't sure what to think. All he knew was that he didn't want to leave her. Only how could he justify that to her or himself? Everything he'd told Max was still true. They wanted different things in life. If he had only himself to consider, he wouldn't hesitate to make changes. But it wasn't just him. He was an integral part of the Dalton twins' magic show. Plenty of people were counting on him, including his mom and dad, who'd sacrificed their retirement funds to invest in their children's dreams. Their crew and their assistants had families they had to support, and Max was smart and he was talented, but he just didn't have the focus or the drive to deal with the business aspects of the act. So ask her to come with you, he thought. He glanced at the doorway again. She'd already shown she was far more adventurous than he'd ever believed. Hell, that little bikini he'd found had just about knocked him off his feet. He could easily picture her in it. How could he really know what she wanted unless he asked? For the first time, he allowed himself to feel hope where Melina was concerned. Turning back to the mantel, Rhys started sanding with vigor. 1 hour, he'd told her. He'd finish up, take her out, maybe get her some wine with her lunch, and then he'd ask her what she thought about extending her little experiment. Indefinitely. After walking Shasta's small downtown with its quaint shops, including a gold rush museum, Rhys took Melina to his favorite outdoor bistro. As the waiter delivered their meals, Melina deliberately ignored the beautiful weather, as well as the vibrant bursts of azalea vines and roses that climbed the iron trellis surrounding the patio. Instead, she forced herself to remember the intense pain that had crippled her that morning. She knew that in order to avoid even more pain, she had to get away from Rhys as soon as possible. "How about some wine?" Rhys asked. Without glancing up from her salad, Melina shook her head. "Better not. I have a bit of a stomachache." "What? Why didn't you tell me?" At the genuine concern in Rhys's voice, Melina looked up. Guilt almost made her wince. He looked so concerned, and for no reason. She'd only said she had a stomachache to prepare for her escape, but she didn't want to ruin their last moments together either. Reaching out, she squeezed his hand. "It's not too bad, but I should probably just stick with water." He lifted her hand to his mouth and kissed it. Melina closed her eyes, commanding herself not to cry. "So," she forced out, pulling her hand back, "you've got a show coming up, right? Where will you be performing next?" "Reno." "Reno? Not one of your more exotic locales?" Laughing, he shook his head. "No, but it's definitely one of our most important shows." "Why's that?" He leaned back in his seat. "There are going to be some important people watching on Wednesday night. In a way, we'll be auditioning for them. 7 Seas Cruises pulls out of Florida. They want the Dalton twins' magic show to be part of their onboard entertainment, which means we'd have a permanent theater to work out of." Although she wondered why she hadn't heard anything about this before, even from Max, surprise and excitement rushed through her so intensely that she squealed. Despite his casual demeanor, she could plainly see how much the cruise ship opportunity meant to him. "Oh my gosh!" She jumped up and threw her arms around him. "That's amazing! How wonderful! Your parents must be thrilled. You and Max are hitting the big time, just like you always wanted." "Yeah, just like we always wanted." Something in his voice made her step back. Mixed in with his excitement was something akin to nerves, even doubt. He laughed nervously. "Other than the fact that I'm sometimes prone to motion sickness, no. I've been assured the 7 Seas ships have the best stabilizers in the business." She moved back to her chair and sat down. "So when does this contract start?" "We have to get it first, but then it's supposed to start immediately." She waved her hand, indicating it was practically a done deal. "They'll recognize your talent when they see it," she said brightly. "But what about the rest of your tour?" "We have one more gig lined up in Vegas, and then we'd plan to take some time off. Our availability is a huge factor in our favor. Their cruises last from 7 to 21 nights, depending on the itinerary." "Wow, and you'd be performing every night?" "That's the plan." He shrugged. "There's one sticking point. They want an act for their family show, too. I'm not sure we can give them that." "Why not?" "The act's taken a turn since you last saw it. To compete with others, we've upped the adult nature of our shows." She'd been about to take a bite of her salad, but her fork froze in front of her face. Adult nature, she echoed.
Nothing vulgar, he said quickly. Skimpy outfits, sexual humor. His voice remained steady, but a slight blush had risen on his cheeks.
How skimpy are the outfits? She asked suspiciously.
There's 1 or 2 tricks where the assistant goes topless.
Her fork dropped to her plate. Seriously? She squeaked.
Yeah.
But that's objectifying, don't you think?
There's nothing objectifying about nudity.
His lips pressed together.
It's entertainment.
I beg your pardon, but if the nudity is just for titillation, which is what you're talking about, then it objectifies the woman who is nude.
So I take it you don't approve.
Aside from her gut reaction, she couldn't say with certainty whether she did or not. She'd never given it much thought. Plus, she couldn't say for sure whether it was topless assistants she really objected to, or if it was the idea of them prancing around in front of Rhys one night after the other. Whether I approve or not is irrelevant. It's not my act. I guess I just thought your act was good the way it was.
It was good, but it wasn't taking us where we wanted to go.
To the top, she verified.
Yeah.
Melina nodded. It looked like things were lining up for the Dalton family. Although she was happy for them, she couldn't quite picture Rhys living on a cruise ship. Not for very long. But then again, what did she know? After several attempts at eating, she pushed her plate away, no longer having to pretend her stomach hurt.
Melina, maybe this isn't the best time to ask, but I want to know if...
I have to go, she said abruptly. Rhys's mouth snapped shut. He frowned.
What?
She raised a shaky hand to her forehead. I guess I'm feeling worse than I thought. I'd like to go home now.
You mean back to the cabin?
No, I mean back to Sacramento.
But the weekend's not over. What about...
She shook her head. No worries. You're a genius. I didn't need to learn about flirting technique. I just needed to get my confidence up and be willing to try different things. You made me realize that, and I'll always appreciate it. But I think I can take it from here. He stared at her, his face darkening with something close to anger.
What if I don't want you to go home?
Her heart began to race. What do you mean? Leaning over, he took her hands in his.
I mean, I've really enjoyed our time together.
I have to. I suppose Max's plan worked after all. It had worked too well.
Come to Reno with me.
Melina blinked. What?
I know you're supposed to work, but I was hoping you could take some time off.
Whoa, the world seemed to be spinning out of control. He didn't want their time to end either? Wouldn't I just get in the way?
I'd be busy. I have to set up for the show and do rehearsals, but you could hang out, see what it's like. You could visit with Mom and Dad, then whenever I could get away.
What? He wiggled his brows up and down, reminding her so much of Max when he was being naughty. That certainly sounds tempting, but she'd only be putting off their separation, wouldn't she? And it wouldn't be like it was here. She wouldn't have Rhys's undivided attention. That could be a good thing, but it could also be bad. She adored his parents. They never failed to welcome her in and make her feel a part of the family, which would make having to leave all the harder. She just couldn't see spending more time with Rhys, knowing pain would once again be waiting for her. So while her heart was screaming, yes, 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 she forced herself to say, I appreciate the offer, but I'm going to have to say no. I need to get back home and to my lab. He sat back, and for a moment she thought she saw real distress in his eyes. Then he shrugged.
You're right. What was I thinking? There's way too much to do getting ready for 7 Seas and all. I should probably put all my focus into that.
Sure, it's your dream come true after all.
Yeah.
He whispered. He put down his napkin, took several bills out of his wallet, and threw them on the table.
You ready to go?
Chapter 10. Dalton's Magic Rule, number 11. Use your brain and heart as much as your hands. Back at Rhys's cabin, Melina packed up her things while Rhys put away the mantle and tidied up the house. They'd barely spoken on the drive back from the restaurant, and every time she looked at him, she had to force herself not to say, I changed my mind, of course I'll go to Reno with you. This was for the best, she told herself for the 1000th time. This weekend was about empowerment, not emotional suicide, and she was lucky Rhys had been part of it.
You almost ready?
She whirled around at the sound of Rhys's voice. He stood in the doorway, one hand gripping the header and the other tucked behind his back. She arched a brow. Is this another pop quiz? When he smiled, a genuine smile that showed off his adorable dimple, the relief was disorienting. She hated when things were tense between them, but if he could smile, maybe that meant everything would be okay.
I suppose in a way it is, he confessed. I brought your gift with me, but in all the confusion, I don't think I ever wished you a happy birthday.
Playing along, she pretended to think about it. No, I don't think you did.
I didn't think so.
He stepped into the room.
So, are you ready for the question?
She nodded.
What's your favorite bug?
He had to be kidding. Seriously, what kind of question is that? You already know.
Will you just play along?
He gritted out in a long-suffering voice. Okay. She took a deep breath. My favorite bug, she paused dramatically, is the ladybug.
And why is it your favorite bug?
Because of its polka dots, she groaned, remembering the day she'd complained about her mother wanting her to wear a polka dot dress. But dots on a bug are far different than on a dress, especially when you're 14 and fat. He glared at her.
You weren't fat, you were just well-cushioned.
She snorted, even though Rhys, unlike Brian, made it sound like a compliment.
Anyway, maybe you'll feel different about this.
He brought his arm around and held out a small box wrapped in simple ivory paper.
Happy birthday, Ladybug.
She took the box with trembling fingers and tried to blink back her tears. She didn't quite succeed. One trailed down her cheek, and he swiped it away with his thumb. He didn't question her tears, and she didn't explain them. Sitting on the bed, she carefully removed the paper and lifted the lid off the box. A small laugh burst out of her. It's a bikini. He sat down next to her, his expression watchful, as if he wasn't sure whether she liked it.
Yeah, I saw it when I was in France. The white one you have is a lot more daring, but this one...
He shrugged.
I don't know, it just reminded me of you.
She lifted the 2 pieces out of the box. The material was black, sprinkled with red polka dots. They weren't showy, and neither was the cut of the bikini. Unlike the one she'd bought, this one would cover her where she wanted to be covered, yet it was also stylish, hip, sexy. She stroked the fabric as she looked at him. This is how you see me? He frowned a little.
Before I answered, do you like it?
Happiness swelled within her. Before she could think twice about it, she lunged at him, knocking him back onto the bed even as she squeezed him. I love it, thank you. Chapter 11. Dalton's Magic Rule number 12. When all else fails, pull out the rabbit.
Tell me you're joking, Max, please.
At Rhys's urgent tone, she opened the door and saw Rhys pacing as he talked on his cell phone.
Can't they wait until after the 7 Seas performance?
He paused, ran a hand through his hair, then began pacing again.
I know you can't time something like that, but she signed a contract. No, I'm not saying I'm going to sue her, but what does she expect us to do? We hired her specifically because she was shorter than the other girls. That's what the act needs, someone who's about 5'4".
He scoffed, held the phone away from him as if he wanted to throw it against the wall, then snapped it back up to his ear.
Do you know how much time it would take to modify it? Well, I do. A lot.
At his increasing distress, Melina stepped out of the room and caught his eye. She motioned to him in a what's going on gesture. He held up a finger, then told Max,
I'm in Lake Shasta with Melina. I've got to get her home and then I'll catch my flight. I'll see you there before midnight.
He paused, glancing at Melina before he quietly said,
No.
He disconnected the call.
I'm sorry about that. I've got to leave immediately and do some damage control.
One of your assistants can't perform?
She's decided to show her ex that she's serious about reconciliation, and that means she's quitting traveling immediately.
And she's the only girl who can assist with the trick? He pinched the bridge of his nose, his eyes all scrunched up as if he was in pain.
Yeah.
Can't you just do a different trick?
Sure, it's just this trick is pretty spectacular. I think if we nailed it, we'd blow 7 Seas out of the water. Without it,
He sighed and shook his head.
I don't know if it'll be enough. We're competing against some pretty good acts, including the Salvador brothers. They'll be unveiling a new trick too.
Appearing as if he'd suddenly lost the strength to stand, he moved to the sofa, dropped onto it, leaned his head back, and stared at the ceiling. He looked so defeated that she rushed to sit beside him and hold his hand.
I worked so hard on this one, but hey,
he said, looking at her with a strained smile.
Maybe this is a sign that the sea's not for me. We've got our established circuit, we'll just keep working at it.
Why is this contract so important to you? Sure, it's prestigious, but you're so successful already.
It's not just the prestige. It's having the best of both worlds, or as close as you can get. Stability as well as the thrill of performing. Even if that stability's on a cruise ship, it's still better than packing up and then unpacking again every few weeks.
She looked around her at the house Rhys had restored and essentially kept to himself. His complexity was also his weakness. How could he fulfill his thirst for adventure when he equally craved roots to hold him down? She supposed 7 Seas was the perfect solution. I'm so sorry, Rhys, she said, not knowing what else to say. But I'm sure your other tricks will wow 7 Seas too. He took a deep breath and patted her hand absently.
Thanks.
His eyes focused as if he was actually seeing her for the first time since she'd walked out of the bedroom. He kissed her gently.
Thank you for everything.
He leaned his forehead against her, his breath steady and quiet. Finally, he lifted his head.
You ready?
He got to his feet and held out his hand. She automatically took it and stood, even as she strained to think of a solution to Rhys's problem. There must be something they could do, that she could do. She froze. What she was thinking seemed almost laughable, but what other options did they have? She gripped his hand. Rhys, you said 7 Seas is coming for one of your shows. Which one?
The opening night, this Wednesday.
So that's the one that's really important in terms of that particular trick.
Yeah, but like I said, the chances of modifying the apparatus by then are slim.
What if you don't have to modify it? Can you just train someone who's the right size?
I suppose, but who am I going to find now?
He shook his head.
Like I said, we'll figure it.
I'm 5'4". He released her hand.
Huh?
I said, I'm 5'4". I can stand in for your assistant if that would help. I'm sure I'm heavier than her, though, and I'm absolutely not a performer, but... She trailed off. He didn't say anything. He didn't move. He just stared at her, his expression stunned. She could feel herself turning red with embarrassment. You know, it was a stupid idea.
You'd do that for me?
He asked.
Get up in front of a theater of strangers and let me tie you up?
Well, I'd rather not think of the strangers right now.
What about work? You said you had to get back, and to have a shot of pulling it off, I'd need you right away so we could rehearse.
When would you need me by?
Tonight, tomorrow at the latest.
So you can drive me home, I'll pack, call into work in the morning, and fly out tomorrow.
Why would you do that?
She moved toward him, not stopping until she was close enough to take his hands and kiss them. How can you ask me that? I know how much this contract means to you. If I can do anything to help you get it, I will. She dropped her hands and stepped back. I feel a little silly, though. I mean, me on stage. If you want to say thank you and forget it, I understand. He took her hands again.
Thank you,
he said.
And I think...
He paused, and she held her breath, waiting for him to reject her.
I think you'll be perfect on stage.
All she felt was relief. And joy. Really?
Yes.
She jumped up and down in her excitement, her insecurity momentarily forgotten. Okay, then let's do it. She broke away from him and rushed to her bedroom to get her suitcase. He turned to get his own stuff, stopping when she called out, "Oh, and Rhys?"
Yeah?
I just want to make something perfectly clear. Wariness crossed his face.
What?
I'm absolutely not doing anything topless. His mouth quirked.
You sure? Because, man, with your body we could definitely draw in some...
Rhys, she drawled warningly.
Okay, sure, no going topless, but that only applies on stage, right?
As long as we don't have an audience, I think we can make things work.
That's fine with me. I do my best work one-on-one anyway.
Chapter 12. Dalton's Magic Rule number 13. Draw out the tension until the big finish. You should have seen his face when I said I'd help him. He wants that contract. He needs it, and he's relying on me. What if I can't do it? What if I let him down? What if unicorns and flying dragons really do exist? Lucy shot back. Why are you focusing on the show and the contract Rhys may or may not get? He's obviously in love with you. Melina sat down on the bed next to Grace, only to fall backward and stare at the ceiling. Where do you get he's in love with me? He asked you to go to Reno with him before Max called, Grace pointed out. Biting her lip, she sat up. You really think he's in love with me? Yes, Lucy said. Definitely, agreed Grace. Then why wouldn't he just say so? Melina asked softly. Why haven't you told him that you love him? Lucy countered. Wide-eyed, Melina stared at her. Because I'm afraid. Of what? He's not going to reject you. The guy bought you a rocking bikini in France, for God's sake. I'm afraid he'll walk away anyway, she insisted. Lucy opened her mouth to respond, but it was Grace who countered. No, you're not, Melina. You're afraid he'll walk away and ask you to come with him. And you're not sure you love him enough to do it. Melina and Lucy stared at her. Lucy turned to Melina. Is that true? No, I mean... Melina forced herself to look deep for the answer. She glared at Grace. God, I hate it when you do that. Lucy dropped onto the bed beside her. I'm confused. Well, so am I, Melina snapped. Standing, she paced the small area between her bed and her dresser. Grace is right. When we're together, I can't imagine being without him. But when we're apart, I can't imagine fitting into his world. I'm not even sure I want to. Sure, it sounds exciting, but I'm a homebody at heart. I'd like to travel more, but only if I have a home to come back to. Some place to raise my children and make memories. I know now that Rhys wants some version of that too, but I just can't see myself on the road or on the sea, hanging out in the shadows and waiting for him to finish one performance after another. So all this time it hasn't been about whether he could love you, Lucy said. You're saying that even if those things are golden, you're still not sure it'll work out? Those things were definitely real fears, but even without them, yes, I guess I am saying that. For the first time Melina could remember, Lucy didn't seem to know what to say. That was so not okay. So what do I do? Melina cried. Grace knelt in front of her and took her hands in hers. You're already doing it, sweetie. You're leaving your world and venturing into his. No speculating about what it's like anymore. No wondering whether you like it. One way or another, you're going to find out the answer to that pop quiz. Being with him would require you to change your whole life. If you decide you don't want to do that, then he's not the guy for you. So what? Maybe Jamie is. Please, Lucy rolled her eyes. Professor Jamie Whitcomb isn't the type to inspire passion in any woman. He's too arrogant and uptight for his own good. Melina studied her friend, forgetting her own troubles for a second. Where's all this hostility coming from? I thought you barely knew Jamie. Oh, I know him all right. When she didn't elaborate, Melina turned to Grace. Turns out the dean wants Lucy's department represented at the conference tomorrow as well, Grace explained. Since Jamie's coordinating it. Melina gasped. The conference. She gripped Grace's hands. The conference. I'm supposed to speak with Jamie. He's depending on me. Lucy waved her hand dismissively. Oh, please, like anyone'll miss you. She didn't miss Melina's glare. You know what I mean. You've got a PowerPoint presentation set up, right? Either Jamie can pick up the slack or someone else can. You, Melina said the same time she thought it. Looking at her like she was crazy, Lucy laughed and held out her hand. Excuse me? I don't think so. I have to attend the conference, against my will, I might add, in order to network at the reception. But I wasn't planning on attending any of the presentations beforehand. You can do my presentation with your hands tied behind your back. You're a quick study and you have no problem speaking in public. I'm not an entomologist, Lucy exclaimed, beginning to look a little panicked. I don't know a thing about bugs. Melina rushed to her desk in the living room and returned to the bedroom with a folder, neatly organized and tabbed. You don't have to. Like you said, everything's set up. You just have to read my notes. Please, Lucy. I... Looking like a hunted rabbit, Lucy turned to Grace.
I'm out of town that day,
Grace said quickly. Please, Lucy, he's not my soulmate, but I like Jamie and respect him. I can't just ditch him. This conference is a huge deal, and as the organizer, he's going to be swamped. Do this for me and I'll owe you, I promise. You'll owe me, huh? Lucy said, still looking like she'd rather eat dirt. Melina just nodded and held out the folder. With a sigh, Lucy took it. Fine, I'll keep you in Jamie's good graces, just in case you decide you don't want Rhys as much as you thought. It's not Rhys I'm unsure about, Melina insisted. Not anymore. Honey, it's all part of the package, right? You can't have Rhys without all the rest. After her friends left, Melina thought about what Lucy had said. She thought about it as she finished packing. She thought about it when she boarded the plane the next morning. And she thought about it as she walked outside to meet Rhys. When she saw Rhys, she dropped her luggage and ran into his arms, almost crying with relief when his arms wrapped around her and pulled her in close. She opened her mouth and tried to say it. I love you. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. If that means going on the road or living out of a suitcase for the rest of my life, I'll do it.
You ready to get to work?
He asked with a grin. She forced a smile. You tie me up, you work your magic, I just need to smile and look pretty, right? How hard can it be? Jillian knocked on the dressing room door even louder this time.
Aren't you ready yet?
Melina stared at herself in the full-length mirror, cringing at what she saw. The sparkly outfit that Jillian was trying to alter to fit her form was her exact size, only Rhys's runaway assistant had obviously had more to love on top than she did. Instead of enhancing her minimal curves, the droopy neckline made her look flatter than an ironing board, and the minuscule skirt made her thighs look like tree trunks. I told you it doesn't fit, Melina called out again, wondering if the woman was hard of hearing. Of course it doesn't, Jillian called, her voice clearly reflecting her impatience. I'm not done with it yet. Now come out here so you can get back to practice. Melina groaned. Practice, right. She and Rhys had been practicing ever since they'd arrived from the airport. Not that he was a slave driver, he'd given her plenty of breaks for food and for nookie, but as soon as they started practicing again, it was all business. Her body ached from having to stretch out and hang for so long from the metamorphosis apparatus. Knowing she couldn't put it off any longer, she opened the door and peeked out. Jillian whirled around and waved her closer. Come on out so I can see what I'm working with. Reluctantly, Melina stepped into view. Instead of laughing as Melina had expected, Jillian nodded. Good, that's good. Good? Melina echoed in astonishment. I look like a pear shoved into a 70s-era tube top. You leave it to me. By the time I'm done with this costume, you'll look like you were born to walk that stage. Yeah, except I won't be doing much walking, more like hanging, she mumbled, then felt like a whiny fool. She was hanging with Rhys and for Rhys, that's all that should matter. It was as if Jillian could read her mind. Yes, well, that's what women do for the men they love. Melina automatically shook her head. I'm just doing a friend a favor. Now Jillian did laugh. Okay, honey, but don't worry about it. It doesn't matter that they've never dated anyone more than 6 weeks. We all fall in love with one of those boys at some time or another. Not all of us are lucky enough to get that love return, that's all. From what I hear, they've done plenty of loving to go around. Jillian shot her a disappointed look. You are supposed to be the smart one, right? Before Melina could do more than gasp, Rhys's mother, Rachel, swept in. They'd already visited several times, but it was still a nice surprise to see her again. The way she hugged Melina suggested she felt the same. So what do you think, Jillian? Didn't we tell you Melina is an absolute doll? Nodding, Jillian tugged at Melina's dress and adjusted pins here and there. She sure is. A little dubious about your boy's reputation with the ladies, but other than that, she's fine by me. Melina blushed and tried to stammer out a reply, but Jillian just planted her hands on her hips and eyed her up and down. Yep, a crowd's gonna love her, she declared. Let's just hope 7 Seas does. Rhys's mother looked at her watch.
You've got enough time for one more rehearsal, Melina, but Rhys says you've caught on really fast. He's quite impressed with you, young lady."
"What's Rhys doing now?" she asked, trying to appear only casually interested.
"He's rehearsing on the main stage with Max and the other girls."
"Can I go in and watch?"
"Of course," Rachel exclaimed. "You're one of the crew now."
One of the crew. As Melina peeled out of her horrid costume and dressed, a smile crept across her face. Despite some lingering nerves, part of her was starting to feel like part of the crew. Everyone was friendly and had welcomed her with open arms, chattering with her about their families and the excitement they felt about getting the Seven Seas contract. As she rushed to the main stage, Melina thought about what Jillian had said, that everyone fell in love with Rhys or Max at some point, but only a special few were lucky enough to have that love returned. She'd known Rhys and Max loved her since she was 14 years old. Despite the ups and downs between them, she'd known she could count on them if she ever needed them. Her presence proved they could do the same. Taking care to be quiet as she opened the heavy doors to the theater, she sneaked into the very back row and watched as Rhys performed one trick after another. There were 2 other female assistants who assisted in the act. Having hung from the metamorphosis apparatus and seen Rhys's complicated new trick for herself, she now knew why they required a female assistant of shorter stature. That wasn't true for his other tricks. The 2 other girls, introduced to her as Amanda and Tina, were close to 6 feet, their bodies thin yet curvy, especially in the chest area. Amanda had long, multi-hued blonde hair, and Tina had a wavy red bob that looked perpetually disheveled. They were model gorgeous, and it would have been easy to hate them both but for the fact that they were extremely nice and down-to-earth. Amanda had a degree in nursing, and Tina wore crystals and had offered to give Melina a tarot reading. She liked them, even if they did make her feel like the dumpy nerd who didn't quite belong. With a flourish, Rhys finished one trick, then switched places with Max, who'd been sitting in a chair at the side of the stage. She hadn't spent a lot of time with Max, other than to scold him, then kiss him for what he'd done at the hotel. She hadn't brought up Trisha or the incident from 12 years ago, and neither had Rhys. Still, she could tell Max was feeling awkward about things. He was more quiet than usual, and except for rehearsals, he kept mostly to himself. She'd asked Rhys about it, but he'd just shrugged, saying Max could be moody, but that he'd eventually snap out of it. The music cued, and another trick began, everyone flowing around the stage like they were born to be there. At one point, Rhys called out for them to stop, and he and Max discussed something while the girls left the stage. Melina felt so proud as she watched them. They were good at what they did, and it was obvious that while Max and Rhys were a team, Rhys made things happen. He kept things running. He was the heart of the Dalton twins' magic act. Without him, it couldn't possibly survive. More important, he clearly loved what he did. Being around his family and performing with them gave him a spark and vitality that had been missing before, even when he'd been relaxed and having fun in Lake Shasta. Knowing she didn't have much time before she'd be called to the stage herself, Melina got to her feet and quietly made her way toward the exit. She was almost there when she saw Amanda and Tina return. They were topless. Rhys and Max glanced up, then kept talking, obviously unfazed by their nudity. Melina, on the other hand, felt the ground drop out from under her. Bracing herself with a shaky hand, she slowly lowered herself into another seat. She watched as Max performed one illusion after another, the whole time keeping at least one of the girls close. Melina knew it was all for show, that it didn't mean anything to any of them, but she couldn't help thinking of the way Rhys had touched her when they'd practiced too. And even though it wasn't him touching the girls now, she knew he and Max traded off performing every trick, so he'd touch them at some point and would continue to do so. Someone touched her shoulder and she jerked her head around. Rhys stood beside her, his mouth grim. "Hey," he said. She turned back to the stage. "Hi," she whispered. He lowered himself to the seat beside her and sighed. "I warned you there were a couple of acts that contained nudity, Melina." Nodding, she licked her lips. "Yeah, you did. You didn't tell me how often you got to cop a feel, though." As soon as the bitter words left her mouth, she wanted to call them back, but she couldn't. And she couldn't pretend it wasn't how she felt. Not so much because the touching was sexual or even offensive, but because it seemed to highlight just how different their lives really were. He lightly grasped her arms and turned her to face him. "It's just an act, the equivalent of an on-screen kiss. It doesn't mean anything." "I know that, but it means something to me," she thought. And this is what he'd be doing night after night while I waited for him, while I give up my life for him. She was an insecure person during the best of times. How low would she stoop if she had to imagine Rhys's hands on another woman's body every night? She stood. "I was just going to get something to eat before we rehearse. What time should I be back?" "Melina, can we talk about this?" "There's nothing to talk about," she said with a thin smile. "This is your life, and there's nothing wrong with it. Now, what time do you want me back?" "We'll rehearse in an hour. Does that work?" "An hour's good." She tried to move past him, but there wasn't enough room unless she wanted to squeeze by and brush against him. Knowing it was silly, she turned and walked down the other side of the aisle, slipping outside through another door. She didn't look back, but she never got something to eat either. Instead, feeling more like an outsider than ever, she wandered the streets outside the theater until she came to a nest of shops. One in particular caught her eye, and she stopped to stare at the display window. The mannequin decked out in leather should have looked ridiculous, but to Melina it represented the daring, almost surreal nature of Rhys's celebrity lifestyle. Foreign, exotic, out of reach. Yet she reminded herself that she'd been enjoying her time here, that she'd begun to acclimate to his world. So what if she'd suffered a slight bump in the road? Why couldn't she don the leather outfit in the window just as she had Jillian's stage costume? Although it probably wouldn't feel right at first, she'd eventually grow accustomed to it. Wouldn't she? At the very least, Rhys would know she was willing to try. Maybe, regardless of her reaction to his topless assistance, things could work out for them. Maybe she just needed to prove it to herself, and this hollow feeling of despair would vanish forever. But if she was going to take risks, she wasn't going to be the only one. If she was going to strip herself bare for him, then he was going to do the same. Only then would she believe the depth of his feelings for her. With newfound resolve, Melina walked into the store. That night, after rehearsal was finally over, Rhys practically speedwalked back to his hotel. He was exhausted, hungry, grumpy. None of that compared to the desperate need he had to see Melina and confirm that things were okay between them. When he'd noticed her at the back of the theater, her eyes on Max and the topless assistants, he'd felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. She'd looked so sad, defeated. Nothing like the woman who'd been gamely trying to adjust to the foreign world she'd been shoved into. He'd been a mess after that, distracted, edgy. But when she'd shown up for practice, Melina had seemed to be back to her regular self. She'd laughed when he'd teased her, and she'd given him a nice, long kiss before she'd left the theater, saying she'd have a surprise for him back at the room. Now, 2 hours later, all he wanted was to crawl into Melina's arms. He wasn't even nervous about tomorrow's show. Whatever the outcome, he just wanted to know what his future with Melina had in store. He was going to do what he should have done a long time ago. He was going to give Melina a choice. Home and hearth, or him. And it didn't matter whether it was fair or not, but he was going to do everything in his power to make sure she chose him. When he opened the door to their suite, he did so quietly in case Melina was sleeping. Sure enough, the bedroom was dark, quiet except for the steady buzz of the air conditioner. He shut the door, then flicked on the bathroom light so he could undress. When he saw Melina, he froze. Melina? Music with a slow, hip-thrusting beat began to play. From her seat in the corner, Melina stood and walked toward him, her hips swaying exaggeratedly, her steps keeping time with the music. Was she wearing a corset? She was. It wasn't just any corset either. It was made of soft black leather that molded itself to her curves. Makeup, More makeup than he'd ever seen her wear layered her face, making her look like a stranger. A beautiful, tempting, lustful stranger, but a stranger nonetheless. She looked at him challengingly, crooked her finger, and urged him closer. He didn't move. "Where'd you get that?" he asked hoarsely. There are plenty of shops around. Spreading her legs wide, she planted her fists on her hips, a cocky, superwoman stance that called attention to the 4-inch spike heels she was wearing. "What do you think?" He paused, knowing "you look like a stranger" wasn't the right thing to say. "Hot. You look hot." He couldn't help but think of the night he'd walked into a Sacramento hotel room and found her waiting for him. Other than the unexpectedness of it, that had felt right. Something here was off, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Pulling out a chair, she slowly turned it until she could straddle it. Whatever was going on here, they'd deal with it. He stalked closer. "Stop," she commanded. He did, even as he clenched his fists and sucked in air like a locomotive. "Perform for me." "It's been a long night, baby. I don't think I'm up." She stood and pointed to the chair she'd vacated. "Now you sit here. Put your hands behind your back." "The outfit I like, but not the makeup, not the attitude. I don't want a sexy stranger. I want you. I love you, Melina. Don't you get that by now?" "What do you want from me? I'm trying to fit in. I'm trying to give you the excitement the other women in your life have given you." He clenched his teeth. "No one has given me what you have, Melina. No one. You make me feel things that no one else can. Right now, that includes making me furious, but I love you all the same. That's not going to change, and you don't have to change who you are because you're afraid it will." "But that's because we're here and because it's all new. What happens when you realize I don't fit in? What happens when you lose interest? 'Cause you will lose interest, Rhys. You always do."
"What the hell does that mean?"
"You've never dated someone more than 6 weeks."
"Who told you that crap?"
She pressed her lips together.
"I noticed you didn't respond to my declaration of love. How am I supposed to interpret that?"
"I've told you before that I love you."
"Yeah, but at the same time you said you love Max. So what's it gonna be, Melina? I love you. I know my life isn't what you would choose, but I have other people to consider. I want to know, do you love me and do you want to be a part of my life, whatever that entails?"
"Whatever that entails," she sniffed derisively. "You don't ask for much, do you?" His shoulders dropped and he stared at the floor.
"And that's not a very encouraging answer, is it?"
"You can't just..." They both flinched when someone pounded on the door.
"Rhys, Melina, open up, we got trouble."
It was Max. Melina jumped to her feet as Rhys answered the door. Max strode in, after taking in Melina's makeup and eyebrow-raising outfit, as well as their grim expressions. He shook his head.
"Great, I can see things are going swell in here too. What is it?" "Someone got into the theater after practice. I came back because I'd forgotten to lock up and..."
"And what?" Rhys prompted.
"And the metamorphosis rack's been destroyed."
Melina gasped and immediately covered her mouth with both hands.
"What?"
Rhys whispered. He dropped into the chair that still sat prominently displayed in the center of the room. He saw Melina move toward him, then stop. That hurt more than what Max had to say next.
"Someone took an axe to it. It's in pieces. There's no way you'll be able to fix it, not before the show tomorrow."
2 days later, Melina was in her lab trying to focus on her current experiment. It was a little tough when her eyes kept tearing up and she had to excuse herself yet again so she could cry in private. She'd called Max first thing this morning and he'd told her that 7 Seas had decided to book the Salvador brothers as their permanent act. When Melina had asked about Rhys, Max had laughed bitterly.
"Rhys is gonna be fine, Melina. He'll bounce back with something that will make 7 Seas come crawling back to us on their knees, I guarantee it. Recovering from what you did to him isn't going to be quite so easy."
She stiffened at the censure in his tone. "Me? I didn't..."
"You couldn't get away from here fast enough, could you? The moment you weren't needed for the act, you left."
"I talked to you and Rhys. I asked you if you needed me for anything, and you both said no. Rhys wouldn't even talk to me."
"He was upset, and when he's upset, he withdraws. That's just how he is. He told me he asked you to stay with him, that he loved you, and that you threw it back in his face." I didn't," she protested. "I did no such thing. I just didn't have a chance to answer. You came into the room and everything was a mess and you got on a plane and flew home. That was your answer, Melina. And Rhys knows it." By the time she'd hung up with Max, Melina had almost been paralyzed with doubt. She'd only wanted to get home so she could think, but had getting on the plane been her answer? Wasn't she entitled to think things through before she changed her life so drastically? She was still questioning herself, what she'd done, and what she wanted when she returned to the lab. Instead of work flying by like it normally did, the hours passed painfully slow, and even then she'd gotten next to nothing done. When she got home, she had a message on her machine. Her heart beating fast, she played it back, hoping it was Rhys. It was her mother, telling her to call her right away. Melina picked up the phone and dialed the number her mother had left. Her mother answered the phone. "Hi, Mom," she said. "Hi, honey. Thanks for calling me back. We'll only have access to a phone for a couple of days until the Vietnam tour starts." "Vietnam? I thought you were still in China." "We left China days ago, dear. Now tell me, how are you?" Melina swallowed hard and tried to answer calmly. Instead, she released a ragged, pain-filled sob. "Oh no, honey, what's wrong?" It all poured out of her feelings for Rhys, the challenge Grace had thrown down, Max's setup with the rooms, the lake and the incredible sex, and the way Melina had alternately felt welcomed and alienated once they'd arrived in Reno. By the time she'd stopped talking, her voice was raspy. There was only silence on the other end of the line. Melina covered her eyes with her hand, appalled that she'd just unloaded on her quiet, reserved mother, especially when she was so far away and couldn't do anything to help anyway. "It's okay," she reassured her. "I'm okay. I just need to accept who I am and what I want. You did that. That's why you left acting, isn't it? Because you were more suited to the type of life Daddy led." "Oh, please, Melina," her mother said. "You don't really believe that, do you?" "What do you mean?" "I did not leave acting because that life didn't suit me. I left it because I thought that's what I needed to do in order to keep your father. His parents were very conservative and didn't approve of acting. I wanted their approval almost as much as I wanted your father. So I gave up my passion for acting and was fortunate to be blessed with a different kind of passion." "Passion again," she murmured. Her mother was describing exactly what Melina had told Lucy didn't exist. Inside her, hope fluttered its wings like a butterfly just emerging from its cocoon. "So that's what I should do? I mean, you're obviously happy. You don't have regrets." Her mother laughed. "Honey, I have plenty of regrets. And I'm certainly not telling you to follow in my footsteps and give up your life just to be with Rhys." "So you're saying I was right to come back?" "No." "No," Melina echoed. Frustration made her next words harsher than she intended. "What are you saying, Mom? Because I need to know what's the right thing to do." "There is no right or wrong answer, Melina. Things will be what you demand they be." Pulling the phone from her ear, she stared at it, certain a foreign creature must have inhabited her mother's body. Her mother didn't talk like that. Rhys did. Walking into the living room, she put the phone back to her ear. "I don't understand," she breathed. She picked up the picture of Max and Rhys with their dates, the one she'd focused on before propositioning Max. "I'm looking at a picture of Rhys and Max after they won their award in Vegas. They're with their dates, and I'm having a hard time picturing myself with them." "That's because you're looking at the wrong picture. You've got tons of pictures with just you and Rhys. Pull out those and look at them. Ask yourself what you see." "I know what I'll see. Me, as plain and boring as ever." "If that's what you see, you're focusing on the wrong person. Instead of focusing on yourself, focus on Rhys. Then ask yourself what you see." "But Mom..." "I'm sorry, sweetie, but I have to go. I love you." Her mother hung up, leaving Melina to ponder her final words. She put down the framed picture of Rhys and Max and pulled out the boxes of loose photos she kept under her bed. Then she laid a bunch out, pulling out the ones that showed her with Rhys.
Since she'd known him for years, there were enough to cover her queen bedspread. She walked around the bed, studying them, trying to ignore her own image and whether she looked fat or was having a bad hair day. She focused on Rhys, on the expression on his face, on the way he was often looking at her rather than at the camera lens. And she saw exactly what her mother had wanted her to see. She saw the difference between the Rhys in her photos and the one in the frame in her living room. She saw the difference in his expression. She saw the happiness that she brought to him, the same happiness that he'd always made her feel. She called her mother back immediately. "Mom, I know you have to go, but can I just say one thing?" "Sure, honey." "I'm a fool." Her mother laughed. "All scientists must eventually face that which eludes them. Usually that's right before a grand discovery changes their lives." "Do you regret giving up your acting for Dad?" "Yes. But do I regret my life with your father? Not at all. I shortchanged myself, and in doing so I shortchanged your father. You certainly don't need to do the same. I'm sure you can find a way to make your lives mesh into something you'll both be happy with." Chapter 13. Dalton's Magic Rule, number 14. Reveal all the cards in your deck and be willing to make a fool of yourself. With the stage lights shining down on him, Rhys smiled and moved fluidly through the act's closing number. He didn't miss a beat, and the audience was right there with him, a sea of smiling faces that, at least for the night, wanted to believe that life was more than what could be rationally explained. On the inside, he was on autopilot. There was no kick, no rush of adrenaline, no pride that he'd invented over half the tricks in the show. All he could think about was Melina. He winced inside every time he thought of that last night. She'd done exactly what he'd asked her to, taken a risk and tried to please him. Yes, she'd gone too far, and she'd been motivated by fear more than desire, but he should have been more careful in pointing that out. Instead, he'd done exactly what her former boyfriends had done, made her feel inadequate. Granted, that hadn't been his intent, but he'd screwed up so bad it's no wonder she'd ignored his declaration of love and gotten on a plane the first chance she got. Max signaled to him from the right wing, indicating it was time to call the final volunteer from the audience. Rhys nodded, grateful that the end was near. Once the crowd was gone, he'd tell Max what he'd decided. If Melina couldn't stomach living in his world, then he'd have to live in hers. It might be tough at first, but Max was a great magician. If he needed Rhys's help, he'd be there for him, but he was through with touring. He'd already told his parents, who'd offered only their support and well wishes. He loved Melina. If he had any chance of winning her back, that's what he was going to do. With Amanda and Tina backed into the shadows downstage, he moved upstage. "Now for my final trick, I'm going to need the assistance of someone from the audience." Max walked into the audience, approached a dark-haired woman, and began leading her toward the stage. "Ah, lovely. Please step right up here, ma'am." They moved closer, and Rhys strained to see past the glare of the stage lights. He sucked in a startled breath when he recognized Melina. "Melina?" he said, forgetting he was wearing a mic. Her name echoed throughout the theater. "Yes, it's Melina, everyone." Max helped Melina up the stage steps, then used his own mic to introduce her. "Melina has volunteered to place herself in Rhys's capable hands, so let's give her a big round of applause." Rhys could only stare at her. Her eyes were like saucers, and her pale skin was flushed a splotchy red. Her legs were bare, and she wore the same high heels she'd worn with the corset, but her light pale green coat covered what she wore. With two hands she gripped the coat closed, as if she feared he was going to rip it off her. "Honey," Rhys said, no longer caring who heard him. "You don't have to." Max led Melina to the center of the stage and, with a flourish, indicated Rhys should get started. When he hesitated, Max sidled up to him, covered his mic, and gritted, "The sooner you do the damn trick, the sooner you can get her off stage. You might want to do that before she passes out." "Why?" But Max walked off, and Rhys stepped closer to Melina. She looked at him, her mouth trembling. Then she lifted her chin and smiled, a sweet, brave smile. He reached out and squeezed her hand. She squeezed it back. "Do it," she whispered. Snapping out of his daze, Rhys pulled out his scarves. He showed the audience 2 white scarves, then knotted them together. Then he turned to Melina.
"Ma'am, can you tuck these under the edge of your skirt, please?"
Melina took the scarves with one hand, keeping a death grip on her coat with the other, and awkwardly tucked them under the bottom of her coat. Stooped over, she looked up at him questioningly. Rhys cleared his throat.
"Good. Now, can you tell me what color underwear you're wearing?"
Melina's eyes got even wider. Why?" she stuttered. Rhys smiled and turned to the audience.
"Smart woman. Always ask questions before you tell a strange man anything about your panties."
The audience laughed, and Melina just stared at him, frozen and silent. They'd never rehearsed this particular trick in front of her, so he told her so she wouldn't be nervous.
"If you tell me what color your underwear is, I'm going to make a scarf of that exact same color magically appear, tied between the 2 scarves you've got under your skirt."
She smiled. "Really? You can do that? That's amazing."
"I can do a lot of things with my hands that would amaze you."
The audience laughed, but he barely heard them. He and Melina smiled at one another, and for the first time in days, the tension eased out of him. Things were going to be okay. Melina straightened, letting the tied scarves flutter to the floor. "Instead of telling you what color my underwear is, can I show you?" Rhys laughed nervously and jerked his head at the crowd that had suddenly gone quiet.
"Honey, I know I tend to make a woman forget where she is, but we've still got an audience here."
"I know," she said, "but I'm making a point." She grasped the edges of her coat. Rhys reached out to stop her.
"Melina, don't."
She whipped her coat off and dropped it to the floor. The audience went wild. From downstage, Amanda and Tina whistled. From stage right, Max whooped and pumped his fist. Rhys just stared. He knew that when he died, hopefully only after a long, full life with Melina, he'd picture her at this exact moment, scared out of her mind, but holding her own, her shoulders back, her chin up, silently daring him or anyone else to respond less than positively to her bikini-clad body. Damn, he was good, he thought, noting that the black and red polka dot bikini hugged her curves in all the best places. The audience quieted.
"You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, Ladybug."
Melina squinted as if straining to see him. That's when he realized she wasn't wearing her glasses.
"Where are your glasses?"
She frowned. In my coat." Rhys snatched up the coat and searched the pockets until he found her glasses. Carefully, he slipped them on her nose. She blinked at him. He grinned.
"When you want to make a point, you go all out, don't you?"
"Being in love with a professional magician isn't going to be easy. I have to upstage you every now and then."
"So, you're in love with me?"
Melina nodded. "For years."
"Love, as in love?
Love, she echoed. He dipped his head and kissed her, a reverent meeting of lips that drew an awe from the audience. Throwing her arms around him, she buried her face in his chest. "Can we get off stage now?"
"You bet."
Rhys turned to Max.
"Can you take over from here?"
Max strode up to them, hugged them, then turned to the audience.
"Talk about a tough act to follow. Now, ladies, who's wearing something that can compete with that bikini?"
The audience roared as Rhys helped her into her coat and off the stage. He ushered her into his dressing room before sweeping her off her feet and twirling her around. "Wait, I forgot something." Rhys groaned.
"Can it wait? I'm right in the middle of a performance here."
She giggled. "It'll take just a second, I promise." He took a deep breath.
"Okay."
"I'm ready to answer the pop quiz now," she said. Rhys laughed.
"Okay,"
he repeated. "What would I do to have you?" she reminded him. "That's what you asked me."
"I haven't forgotten, so what's your answer?"
Reaching into her bikini top, she pulled out the small booklet. He stared at it.
"It's your passport."
"That's right. Now open it." He did. Stuck in between the blank pages was the paper lizard he'd given her so long ago.
"You kept it."
"I didn't answer you before, and I'm sorry about that. I love you. If you still want me to, I want to be a part of your life. I can't travel all the time because I know that won't make me happy, but I don't think that's what will make you happy either."
"So, what are you proposing?"
"I propose that we put our heads together and do what we do best."
"Tell me," he whispered.
What else? We're going to make magic, she whispered back. Epilogue. Dalton's Magic Rule number 15. The show must go on. Melina looked up as Rhys walked into the house. He sighed as he put down his briefcase and loosened his tie, everything about him radiating exhaustion. Concerned, she strode toward him. He smiled when he saw her. "Hey, Ladybug." "Hi yourself," she said, giving him a hug and a light kiss. He growled when she pulled away, cupping her head and pressing her close for a longer, deeper set of kisses. Before she knew it, he was backing her into their bedroom and going at her clothes with a determination that made her laugh. "And here I thought you were tired," he tisked. "I'm never too tired for this." As always, he put his best effort forward with magical results. An hour later, they were lying content in each other's arms when Melina remembered. Lucy called. And? There was no mistaking the wariness in Rhys's tone. She said the dean is bugging her about doing another presentation with Jamie. Apparently, they made quite an impression the first time. How fast did she say no? Actually, I was surprised. She said yes. She grumbled about it the whole time, though. She said she's trying to soften the dean up so she'll get some extra grant money. Rhys snorted. Soft isn't really Lucy's thing. She's got the hots for the professor. Melina gasped. Are you kidding? Lucy and Jamie? No way. That's like putting together... What? Rhys questioned. A footloose professional magician and a small-town entomologist? He tugged on her arm and she curled back into him. I suppose anything's possible, but that would be truly shocking. As shocking as Max having the hots for Grace? What? She shrieked. She shoved him away, stood, and slipped into her robe. After tying her belt, she propped her hands on her hips. Okay, now you're just playing with me. Rhys threaded his fingers behind his head and shrugged. When? The night after you accosted me on stage wearing nothing but your bikini. Grace called the theater to check in with you, and Max answered the phone. I have no idea what was said or if and when they've ever met in person. All I know is that he's been walking around in a daze, muttering her name. He's reverted back to his old ways, nothing like the new and improved Max Dalton, magician and host of the getting-to-be-quite-famous Dalton Theater. Still trying to imagine Grace with Max, or heaven forbid, Lucy with Jamie, Melina walked to her dresser and touched the little box she'd set there earlier. Smiling wickedly, she decided to wait a little longer before she gave it to him. Well, I suppose he deserves some time off for good behavior. Let's not forget we're together because of him. Rhys snorted. Let's not forget he's the reason I didn't get you when you were 16. Like that would have happened. When he stared at her, she smirked. Okay, it would have definitely happened, but who can blame him for being jealous of you? He felt bad and tried hard to make amends. Rhys stood and waved his palm in front of her face. Hello? This is the same man who copped to taking an axe to Metamorphosis. Melina smacked his hand away. Impulsive, but determined. He knew you weren't going to be happy with 7 Cs, so he made sure it didn't happen. Then he worked like a madman to get you guys signed at the Portofino Casino. You both did. I suppose, Rhys grumbled. In any case, the meeting with the attorneys to nail down the final contract went well today. He lit up. Now I get to enjoy the fruits of my labor, while he has to slog through standing-room-only performances in the newest luxury resort in Vegas. Melina rolled her eyes. Yes, I'm sure all that fame and female attention will get old eventually. Be honest, do you have any regrets about leaving the act? Nope. I love my life. I love our home. Love being able to travel with you when we want. Love that I get to manage my brother's flourishing career and charge him an obscene amount of money for the tricks that I invent for him. Most of all, I love that I can have all that and you can be happy studying your bugs at UNLV. I love you. She smiled. I love you forever. This has been Flirting with the Wrong Brother, written by Virna DePaul, narrated by Ellen Lang. Copyright 2009 by Virna DePaul. Production copyright 2013 by Virna DePaul.